I met my wife when I was 26. I suppose it can be considered ironic, really, that it was a funeral which brought us together, especially considering the events I would experience upon moving in with her. I was never really a believer of the paranormal. I guess if we have to apply labels to ourselves, mine would be of a skeptic. Of course, like most people, I had watched various videos on the internet, read stories of hauntings, and occasionally indulged in the odd horror film or two. But my interests were only ever viewed from an outside perspective, and could only really be considered academic at most. Without a frame of reference, I found it hard to believe in these stories, and view them as anything but stories. That would soon change, however, as we quickly fell in love, and I moved in with her shortly after. She had told me about the house before I moved in. She had been living there for 10 years before she had even met me, and by that time there was a lot to tell. Her friends had all experienced something there. They each had their own tale of the unknown. One of her oldest friends had an experience while staying over for the night. Witnessed what can only be described as the outline of a woman move slowly through the room before dissipating abruptly into the darkness. He never slept alone in the house again. My soon-to-be stepchildren would often, when young, point to an empty space in the corner of a room and innocently ask, "Who is that lady?" A horrifying experience, of course, but discountable on its own. If it were not for the other children who would always say the same thing. Every single time they visited our home, it would always be the same question, and it would always be the same corner of the room. Things would only get worse. I remember how my wife recalls the odd smells which would materialize as if from nowhere, the unexplainable noises which would break the peace of the night, and foreboding feeling of not feeling quite alone when you knew you were the only person in the house. It did not take her long to reach out to a paranormal investigation team. They attended our home with Kieran O'Caffey, a paranormal investigator who enjoyed a brief stint of fame after being featured on Most Haunted, a television show which ran here in the United Kingdom. They brought along a psychic who, not long after entering the home, had an unnatural aversion to one particular corner of the room which would soon become my new bedroom, and the particular corner where the children had witnessed the lady. Without any prompt, the psychic explained to my wife that the previous occupant of our house, a woman, had ended her life via rope in that very corner. She finished her reading of the house by sketching a picture of the apparition, a drawing my wife still keeps to this very day. Suffice to say, all of this did little to alleviate my wife's concerns. And this is where I come in. Poor naive me, brazen and full of all the misplaced logic that only a skeptic would apply to a situation which so clearly required it. Well, I even decided that our bed would go in that corner of the room. Looking back now, I can only lament at my childish bravado. My first night was unremarkable, of course. There was the typical excitement about me moving in, but nothing which could be considered otherworldly. At that point in my life, I knew I wanted to be a writer, but lacked any real motivation. That did not stop me, however, from tapping away at my laptop until the early hours of the morning, while my wife slept soundly in the corner. Around 1 in the morning was when it started. It began slightly at first, but it quickly became more noticeable as the minutes progressed. A sound, a noise of sorts. It sounded like scratching, and it was coming from the direction of our bed. I paused my work for a second and turned quickly around in the darkness, my ears directing me towards the source of the noise. My wife was still sleeping in the corner, her face concealed by the shadows. She lays stationary, blissfully unaware of the unnatural sound which had itched its way from the wall near her head. Now, however, I gazed into the blackness of the room. The noise could no longer be heard, almost as if it were never there. A fleeting shimmer of imagination jolted into existence by my wary, fatigued mind. The room all of a sudden felt tight and confining. The walls, although stationary, appeared to have moved an inch while I was busy, closing themselves while restricting my movement. It was an odd sensation, one which burrowed deep, one which felt as if it would be with me for quite some time to come. Chalking the whole feeling up to exhaustion, I closed my laptop and quietly climbed into bed next to my wife. Predictably, sleep came soon. "What are you doing?" I inhaled deeply, my body swaying somewhat as my consciousness returned to me. "Baby, what are you doing down here?" It took a second for my mind to return to me, but when it did, I found myself awakening abruptly, standing on my feet in the middle of our pitch-black kitchen. "It's just after 2. Are you okay?" Even through the darkness, I could see the concern etched into my wife's beautiful features. Her eyes were wide and telling as her lips repeated her plea for answers. "Are you okay?" It took a second to collect myself, my confusion crippling in a heavy sort of way. "I am," I began, my mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. "I think I was just sleepwalking," I added. My words sounded more of a question than a statement. My wife looked me over once before the concern drifted from her face. "Shh, it's okay," she whispered, extending her arm out to me. "Let's get you back to bed." I weakly offered my arm and allowed her to guide me back upstairs to our room, where I quickly fell back asleep. Up until this point, I had never sleepwalked in my entire life. I talked in my sleep, sure, but never sleepwalking. That was news to me, and it was a disturbing sensation to say the least. It followed me into the next day and persisted throughout. Somehow it felt more than just sleepwalking. Somehow I just knew. The day passed like a dream, and before I knew it, night had fallen once more. "Do you want to talk about it?" my wife asked, lying next to me on the bed. I shook my head. Even though the room was silent, I still felt as if I could hear the scratching. "No, I'm fine," I lied, as I pulled the covers over and turned over. "Okay, I love you, baby," she whispered. "I love you too." It's dark, and I'm standing in our kitchen. I inhaled deeply and took a second to steady myself, my limbs shaking as the realization of what happened crept slowly through my body. This time my wife wasn't there to comfort me. This time, every single drawer had been removed from their cabinets and were now perched precariously on the various surfaces above. What is happening? Confused and distressed, I began to quietly slip each drawer back into the cabinet which housed them, and then slunk carefully back upstairs to bed. Just before my fragile mind drifted back into the sleep of abyss, I felt as if I could hear it again, a scratching, tearing and cutting somewhere deep within the walls. I did not tell my wife of this second transgression. I thought she would only worry. Ironically, this seemed to make matters worse as she quickly picked up on my silence throughout the day as we continued unpacking the rest of my belongings. "What's wrong?" she asked, sitting next to me on the sofa. I struggled to comprehend an answer. After all, what was wrong? I couldn't even fathom a response, let alone formulate the words required to convey the feeling which lingered deep inside me. My lips moved, and I found myself saying the first thing which came into my mind. "I think we should move the bed." She nodded slightly at my words. She knew what I meant by them, even though I never actually had to say it. "Okay, we can move it first thing tomorrow. One more night, okay? Because I'm shattered. One more night. I could make it one more night. The hours passed, and again the sky turned black as we drifted peacefully off to sleep. Baby, stop, please, you're scaring me. Suddenly I was aware that I was not in bed. I was standing, but was still in the room. A few seconds later I realized I was standing upright on the bed facing the wall. I looked down at my wife, the horror clear even through the darkness. "What?" was the only word which seemed to come. She was shaking, obviously. After a few moments of silence, she collected herself and brought her arms up to me. "Come on, come here." Confused, I once again allowed myself into her arms as she guided me back into the mattress. Her hand moved up to my hair as she began to run her fingers lovingly through it. "Shh, it's okay. Go back to sleep." My mind quickly sank back into nothingness. In the morning, she explained exactly what happened. She had awoken suddenly in the night when she realized that I wasn't laying next to her. After rolling over, she was shocked to find me standing upright on the bed, silently and still staring at the wall with my back to her. She tried to call out to me before I finally answered. Understandably, this shook her up quite a bit. I went on to divulge the second instance of my sleepwalking, and soon after we moved the bed from the corner of the room. To this day, we've never slept in that corner again. It's been 6 years since then, and we still avoid going anywhere near that corner. My sleepwalking has not happened since we moved the bed, and thankfully, I've never heard the scratching again either. To be honest, I try not to think about those 3 nights so long ago. It's hard to because I never really got any closure. If I had seen a ghost, if I could have at least pointed a finger, "Yep, ghouls." If I maybe had seen a rat or a mouse, I could have explained away the scratching. But there was nothing. It all just stopped just as suddenly as it had begun. The second we vacated that particular corner of the room. And I guess looking back on it now, that's the most horrifying part of it all. I will never know why these things happen. And even more hauntingly, I will never be able to predict if they will ever happen again. And that is the thought which lingers most during the dark nights, repeating with my mind as I tap away at my keyboard and hoping to God that I never hear that awful scratching ever again. About 8 years ago, when I was a senior in high school, me and 2 of my very close friends decided to break into this house that was down a back road that we passed every day to go to one of their houses after school. The house was kept up, but no one had lived there in over 10 years at the time. And by kept up, I mean the lawn was mown and the lights were always on. It was pretty well known in the community that no one lived there, but the bills were paid by someone, and no one had lived there in years. So being teenagers, we decided to check it out after dark. There was a driveway that led to a covered garage in the back of the property that couldn't be seen from the road. We pulled in just after 11 p.m. and made our way back to the garage, and we parked. The entrance was clear, and there wasn't a soul around. Since the garage was behind the house, we made our way to the back entrance of the house and noticed there was a plywood slab that covered the back door's windowed top half. We proceeded to pry the cover off the door and revealed that the windows had been broken before, probably by another group of teens in the past, and we had our entrance. Once we climbed through, each helping the last through the window and into what was the kitchen at the back of the house. Once in the kitchen, we moved to the eerily tidy living room of the house, which was sort of infamous for being the room in the house with the lights on. There were magazines all dated to 1998, stacked neatly on the table in the middle of the room, and it was fairly clear that an elderly woman had once been the occupant. There was a sewing station and decor to suggest this. We felt safe at this point. We had made it in there, and there weren't neighbors or anything for half a mile in either direction. We sat around for about a half hour, freestyle rapping, laughing, and smoking a joint. We toured the rest of the house and ended up back in the living room. It was overall pretty creepy, but pretty typical too. Just seemed like a normal household that hadn't been changed in 15 years. This is where it gets weird. We were still cutting up in the living room, and had actually turned the lights off because we were filming each other with my Lenovo laptop, something we did for fun all the time back then, so we could relive it and show our friends that we had braved the empty house on the back road. When all of a sudden, there was a sound like an old guttural truck trying its hardest to stay idling. The uneven rumble of an engine. It's hard to explain. I personally thought for a split second it was the air unit's fan outside the living room wall, or something along those lines. We froze in place and looked around at each other in the dark. Terrified faces stared back at me, illuminated by the glow of the laptop. After 10 seconds of the rumble, there was a squeak, and a heavy truck door slammed shut right outside the living room wall. Now we scrambled. No hesitation, we bolted for the front door that also connected to the living room, because climbing through that back door window would have been difficult in a panic, but the front door had actually been nailed shut. So we turned and ran to the other side of the house, in the back bedroom that was also on the back side of the house. We all three froze and didn't move a muscle. The engine rumble wasn't audible anymore, but we were trapped like mice. There were huge bushes covering every window, and the front door was nailed shut. The only way out was the way we had come in, but we were literally scared motionless. We sat in the bedroom waiting for the police or owner or someone to call out that our fun is over and to come out, but that never happened. There was a window to the backyard in our hiding spot, covered by a huge bush. I personally was directly next to it. My buddies very close to me, almost huddled around me. They could see and hear everything. And let me remind you that after the slam of the truck door, it was absolutely silent inside and out, besides us scrambling to the back. All of a sudden, chills go up my arm and back, and I slowly turn my head to my friends, who looked like they were about to keel over from fright. Footsteps in crunching leaves were coming, slowly, directly to the window that we were hiding behind. They stopped as close as they could, without walking directly into the bush, and we froze again. The footsteps we heard approaching the window were undoubtedly bipedal. After the steps stopped outside the window, we were immobilized with fear for nearly a minute, maybe more. We sat there waiting for the steps to depart or someone to call out at us, which never happened. The steps stopped outside the window and never moved. Only then did we silently agree. It was time to back out the room slowly, as we were horrified by what exactly could be staring towards us in this window. And at that moment we threw caution to the wind. We got up, slowly backpedaled away from the window and made our way into the hallway outside the room, and into the area before the kitchen where our exit was now back in sight. I think all three of us knew that something was very wrong about all of this, and I think getting caught by the police or the owner wasn't on any of our minds. This was very surreal, and felt almost like a prank, because there's no way people of authority would be haunting us in the way whoever was outside had been doing. So fed up of what felt like an eternity of unease and terror, we decided to bolt to the window in the door in the kitchen all at once and go out together, to either face what had been tormenting us or run. Once we were outside, we counted down from 3 and ran past the huge bushes to the left where our stalker had been. I couldn't help it. I had to turn around and look. I turned and all I saw were the lights beaming from the window broken up by the bush and illuminating a patch of ground covered in what appeared to be undisturbed leaves. This made my whole body crawl in a way I've never felt before or honestly after. We made it to my car in the garage, and I backed out and tore away as fast as I ever had. There was no vehicle outside. There wasn't anything. There was a deafening silence and stillness. We are still very uneasy talking about it to this day. Even writing this makes my eyes water and my skin crawl. I've always been a man of science and a huge skeptic, but I can't explain that night. There was something so wrong about everything. Needless to say, we never went back. When I was 10, I used to have a best friend and neighbor who lived up in a very old house. The house was very old, with original wooden floors, doors, and cobblestone foundations. My friend's family have had the house for 3 generations. My friend has 3 other siblings, but he was a surprise child, so by the time I met him, he was the only one living at the house. This was great, as he always had the newest toys and gaming consoles. I came over quite often, and every time I went I always felt that something was off. My friend and I would game quite often on the first floor playing Sims 2 or Halo 2. The house was much more spacious than 3 people could ever need. For this reason, in the summer, they would close off the upstairs to keep the cold air on the first floor. The issue with very old houses is that they use a very unique door for knobs. The people don't know the doorknob is fitted inside a square hole in the door fitted with a skeleton key lock. Through the years, the doorknobs have been lost, leaving only 2 doorknobs to unlock doors around the house. That means that the doors upstairs had no way of opening, as they had no door handles. While me and my friend would play our games, frequently we would hear heavy footsteps moving throughout his old sister's room above us. I asked my friend about it, and he said that it's something that has been happening for ages, and he believes it is due to squirrels in the attic. Normally, I would be inclined to agree, but this felt like heavy boots dragging themselves through the 2 rooms above us, and you could follow the sound as it walked through them. We were in his home a lot by ourselves, as his father owned a construction company on the outside of his property, and his mother worked during the day. This left me very suspicious, as there could be no one in the house other than us. This would happen quite frequently, as my friend had learned to do. The next experience, however, shook me and my friend to the core. Like any other day, I came to my friend's house after school to play games. My friend and I were getting through the last mission of Halo when all of a sudden a huge bang came through the hallway leading to the stairs. This area was closed off, with the remaining doorknobs for the original doors. We turned the corner to discover that the door was wide open, with said doorknob laying on the floor next to it. My friend and I nervously chuckled and thought that his dad may have stayed home, as his room was next to the stairs. We went up the stairs to find that all the doors were open. These doors had no knobs and had no way of opening by themselves. At this point, the hairs on the back of my neck are standing up, and me and my friend are staring at each other. At this very moment, we both flinched as we heard the all too familiar boots dragging themselves through the connected bedrooms. It dragged closer and closer to the doorway. I was petrified, praying that my friend's dad pops up on the other side. Just as the culprit was about to come into view, the footsteps stopped, and there was nothing. At this point, me and my friend jolted into action and vacated the house as fast as possible. We booked it all the way to my friend's dad's construction warehouse, and we found his dad there and told him we think someone got inside the house. He came back with us to find nothing stolen and no signs of anyone being there, though we go up with him to find that the doors that opened followed the direction of the footsteps we could hear moving through the second floor constantly. I never experienced anything like that since, mainly due to both of us deciding to never stay in the house longer than we needed to. To this day, almost 12 years later, I still have no idea what I experienced that day. It did not feel like a poltergeist or anything demonic, but it did give me the vibes of not being welcome there, as well as goosebumps. Whatever had the strength to open those doors shook me to my very core and made me a believer. My father was very no-nonsense, pragmatic, ghosts don't exist kind of guy. He briefly served in the army back in the mid-70s as a rescue and recovery specialist, or as he put it, simply motorpool. The story he shared with me one night while we were out fishing. He had been in Gettysburg as he was a bit of a history buff and wanted to visit some places before settling down, marrying, and having kids. As he lay there in bed at night, it was 1 a.m. or so, and he was a very heavy sleeper. I witnessed this man legitimately sleep through a thunderstorm that flooded most of our downtown area. I've seen him sleep through a tree crashing down next to our tent on a camping trip, and this man would not budge. Back to my main story. He had been sleeping somewhere in or near Gettysburg, and had woken up in the dead middle of the night, feeling like he was being watched. As he glanced around the room, nothing really seemed out of the ordinary, until he heard footsteps in the room. He didn't really give us an idea as to what they specifically sounded like, but as he's laying in bed, he hears footsteps and then watches as the mattress near his feet compresses as if someone's sitting there. But there's nothing there. No silhouette, no body, just a depression in the mattress. As far as I remember, he was alone during this event. He didn't really freak out or lose his mind or anything like that, but he told me that this particular event made him believe just a little bit more in the unexplainable. This takes place 12 years ago. I was 12 years old, and my gifts were starting to happen. My aunt and cousin had stopped by to stay for the weekend. It was a Friday. The day was normal, nothing strange about it. My cousin and I just hang out for the day. My cousin and I had to share a room, and her bed was against one wall, and mine was located at the wall on the other end of the room. Hers was by the door, and mine was against a wall at the other end of the room. That night we both went to sleep as normal. As I was sleeping, I felt someone staring at me, so I woke up. I pulled the covers off me and sat up. Standing at the end of my bed was a little girl around 7 or 8 years old. Just a reminder, my cousin and I were 12 going on 13. She had blonde hair, blue eyes, and was wearing this bright, heavenly-looking dress. She was looking at my cousin at first, who was still sleeping in her bed, snoring. Then she turned to me, smiled. It was a huge, happy smile, beautiful white teeth with no stains. She reached out her hand, and at this point I stood up and ran out the room yelling for my grandmother. "Nana, there's a strange little girl in my room." My Nana gets up and comes with me to the room. She was gone. My cousin was still snoring in her bed, so my Nana said to me, "Matthew, you probably had a dream." I then explained, "No, Nana, I was wide awake. She even reached out to me." She then said, "Don't you think about it anymore, honey. Just go back to sleep and forget it ever happened." So I did. For years I lived thinking it may have just been a dream. Fast forward 5 years. I was 17. I was told that the landlord who owned the house had lived there with his daughters. One daughter was a twin, and they had passed away when they were about 7 years old in the house. The house is located next to a highway. and one day the twin was playing outside with a ball that bounced into the road. As she went after it, someone had decided to start speeding around the corner, and sadly hit the twin as she went out to get the ball. I still didn't think much more of my experience as more than a dream until one day I went to the landlord's house to walk his dog back there, like I had hundreds of times. But this time he let me into his house and look around his antiques, as I have this strange obsession with antiques. I was looking at his family photos when one caught my eye. The picture was of the twins, taken just months before the twin had been killed. It was the little girl I had seen 5 years prior. Blonde hair, blue eyes, same big smile. At that point I connected the pieces and have come to terms with my sighting. I saw her. I saw the little girl. She appeared to me and I don't know why. Now I need to add some minor details here. My cousin and I both have brown hair. I have hazel eyes, she has brown eyes. And one day, soon after my visitation, I was going after something in the same road. And as I did, I heard a little girl yell my name, and I was the only one home. So I turned around and replied before stepping into the road. And as I did, a speeding car went by, and it would have hit me had I stepped out. The next experience I had was when I was 10. I moved into my grandmother's house. Some family problems were going on, and it was decided that I would go live with them. Nothing out of the ordinary my first year there, but that soon changed. My first experience with something strange happened when I was 11. It was a regular night, nothing out of the ordinary. I was sitting down at the table with my nana, playing checkers and having a good chat. Suddenly, we heard someone running through the hallway. My nana did not seem to react at all, so I decided to get up and investigate. She told me to leave it be, but I was a kid and full of curiosity. It was dark, no lights on, and I did not think to turn any on. As I approached the hallway, I heard the footsteps stop. Then they suddenly started to run towards me, not at an extremely quick pace, so fast I couldn't react. Just as they reached me, they stopped, and no one was there. I walked away scared and unsure of what I experienced. As I was walking away, I turned to look back, and that's when I saw a bright light flash, followed by a large orb appearing. It zoomed back into the hallway and vanished. I never told my nana out of fear of not being believed. My next experience happened a few weeks later. I was playing outside alone. My back started to burn and itch, so I went inside and asked my nana to look at my back. She suddenly asks me, "What did you do to your back?" I told her I hadn't done anything. I'd not laid on my back or put my back against anything. It just started burning. My back was covered in scratches, all over, about 13 in total, and they looked like nails had scratched me. The next experiences happened over a period of time. The first one is of multiple experiences that happened on a night like any other. It was just my nana and I living in the house. It was about 9 at night when we suddenly heard people working and talking in the basement. Loud bangs, the sounds of shovels digging up the floor, and the sounds of the floor being hit by something suddenly filled the house. I got scared and asked my nana about it, and she told me it was the ghosts working in the basement. I got the courage to look. I turned the light on and opened the door, fully expecting to see someone standing there. There was nothing. No one. The sound stopped completely, and I decided to go down and look. Nothing was touched, nothing was moved, and no one was down there. As I went to shut the door, I heard someone yell to me, "Let us work in peace." I quickly shut the door and walked away. Then the sound started up again. Fast forward 2 years later, and in the middle of the day it started again. Same thing. No one was there. Fast forward 4 years from there, my nana passed away, and my mum and I moved into the house. I had a friend over, and we were in the living room directly above the basement when suddenly the sound started up again. The floors started to shake, and the loud bangs and talking could be heard throughout the entire house. My mum comes in and asks what the sounds are, and without skipping a beat, I tell her to let the spirits work in peace and to leave them alone. This last one is my final experience. This next story takes place over a period of 8 years. Some backstory. The first part of this house was constructed in the 1850s and was a farmhouse. The next part of the house was constructed in the 1980s, when the landlord I knew who owned it decided to add it on for his wife, who had fallen in love with the house. So because of this, the house had 2 attics. One required a rung ladder to climb into, and had no floor, just a series of boards about 6 feet apart from each other, and was mainly used as an insulation attic. The other was your usual attic, with stairs that led into 2 big rooms. While the attic with stairs we'll call Attic 1, and the one without stairs and a floor we will call Attic 2. Whenever I was told I had to go into Attic 1, I always had a bad feeling, and dread overtook me every time I went. I found myself struggling to go into the attic because of these feelings. Well, every time I'd go in there, I'd hear someone breathing from whichever room would be opposite from me. Regardless of the day or time, it would always scare me. Goosebumps, cold chills, and the breathing would always happen every time I went into the attic, which made it rather difficult to have to go there from time to time. One day, I was asked by my nana to go up and look for something. She told me exactly where it would be. It was in room 2 in a box, up on the furthest corner to the right. So essentially the deepest you could get into the attic. I said okay, even though fear immediately struck me. I was not a scared child. Fear was not a part of me until I moved into this house. So I opened the attic door and thought I heard someone take a step at the top of the attic, like someone had just finished walking up the stairs. So I paused for a moment, took a deep breath, and proceeded to start up the stairs. As I was going up, I could hear whoever walking towards where I would be going, which terrified me, but I proceeded anyway. When I got to the top of the stairs, a shadow quickly went by the doorway I would be walking into. So I looked to my left, and lying on a pile of boxes was an old baseball bat. So I grabbed it, at least to help me relieve my slight fear. As I started creeping towards the doorway, I could hear breathing coming from the room I was in. As I stepped into the room, it stopped. No one and nothing was there, but I knew I had seen and heard someone up there. It's impossible to hide in this attic, because it had no real corners or any place someone could successfully hide in. So I continued to the corner to grab the item, and after some digging I found it. So I quickly walked back to the top of the stairs, and as I started down them I decided to look back towards the room I was in, and saw a shadow standing there. I jumped down the rest of the stairs, shut and locked the door quickly, and gave my nana the item she had asked for. She asked me what happened, and all I could say was nothing. Now I'm going to make the rest of Attic 1's experiences quick, because all of them were like that. Every single time I would go into that attic over the next few years, I'd hear the heavy breathing, watching things move completely by themselves with no possible way for it to happen, and occasionally see more shadows moving by themselves. We would occasionally hear someone walking up there, but never chose to investigate it because we already knew what it was. Now on to Attic 2. This attic. There are no words to describe this attic. When I asked my nana about this attic one day, she told me to never open the door. Upon asking why, all she said was, "Matthew, there's something evil up there. Something so dark and angry it should never be released." So I said, "Okay," and never asked about it again, because I could see the terror in her eyes, and nothing ever scared her. One morning as I awoke from a heavy sleep and started to get onto my PlayStation 2, I heard someone walking up there. 4 extremely heavy footsteps, which would be impossible because there was no floor to walk on, and with the force of these steps, the boards would not have been able to support it. So I decided to wake my Nana and tell her about it, but they had stopped by the time she awoke. So she went back to sleep. This took place when I was 12. A short time later, I was outside throwing a ball against the side of the house where the window to that attic was located. I threw too high and ended up breaking the window, so my grandfather had to get a new window and go up there to fix it. My Nana was furious because she never wanted that attic door to be opened. This is where the activity in the house started to ramp up. A few years later, I was 14 and started to act rebellious against the ghosts in the house and started to say and do whatever I could to get them going. Like an idiot, I'll admit it, but I did not know any better. My bedroom door was located almost just underneath the doorway to Attic 2, and one night I decided to do my best to get them going. So I said, if you were truly real, you wouldn't be scared to make yourselves known. Big mistake. A moment later, I saw a shadow standing outside my doorway, underneath the Attic 2 door, and then I heard it say in a loud, old and stern voice, "No," and it quickly disappeared. Now, listeners, there is still one more part to go in my time in Hell House, but I'm gonna leave this one on a lighter note. As I grew up in the house, I would at random times smell the strong scent of either cinnamon or roses. I would always go tell my Nana when it happened, and it would never be in the same part of the house, and it was never at a certain time. It was always and completely random. When I asked my Nana about it, she told me that our landlord's ex-wife, who passed away in the house, loved the smell of cinnamon and roses. She also told me that when I smelt one, that it was either her warning that either something good or bad was going to happen. When we smelt cinnamon randomly without any source, something bad was going to happen, and vice versa. As an example, one day my cousin, who I mentioned in the story about the little girl, smelt cinnamon at the top of the stairs one day. She went outside to play, that day like any other, but after a while she ran into the house screaming. At one point she had fallen and landed on a corn plant stump, and part of it had gone up her nose. She was quickly taken to hospital. One time when I was 12, I'd smelt cinnamon strongly in the doll room, and later on that night, I had fallen on a trash bag after getting scared by my mum's ex-husband and sliced my foot wide open from something sharp in the bag. Another time, after my grandmother had passed, I smelt roses in one of the rooms, and later on that day I got a promotion and raise at work. That isn't all that she would do though. Before the doll room had become such, it was just another living room with a TV, and was where my Nana would sit and watch TV and rest. But every so often, out of the corner of her eye, she would see a full-body silhouette that was pure white quickly dash from the beginning of the room into the hallway, and it scared my Nana so much that she turned that room into the doll room, where she stored all her dolls and moved her living room stuff to another part of the house. One day, when I was sitting in the doll room looking and studying all the antiques and other collectibles, I too saw this white silhouette dash from the beginning of the room to the hallway. After that, I did everything I could to avoid going into that room again. I hope you enjoyed the stories. Every bit of them is true, and it made my life growing up hard, because I always felt like I was being watched in that house. The first story I'm going to tell you is a story relayed to me by my late father, and it was something that happened to him and my eldest half-sister when she was a teenager. Allow me to give you some background. My half-sister Giselle had always been able to see ghosts since she was a child, and being able to do so has made her feel like she was cursed, especially since the entity she sees always appears solid and showed up unexpectedly during the most unexpected of times. My oldest sister Isabel seems to share that curse, since she experiences the same thing. I, however, can only see shadows from the corner of my eye, as well as feel others' presences when I'm alone. And yet I look, but no one's there. I just pray that I never encounter a ghost up front like my older sisters have. At the time of this event, Giselle was 14 years old, and accompanying my father one weekend as she was scouting for a new house to move into, since Giselle's mother was pregnant with her 6th child, and things were getting cramped in their current residence. My father noticed that Giselle had been clinging to his arm very tightly ever since they entered the front gate, and had been glancing around with clear unease. According to my father, the house was a 2-story house, comfy looking and quite spacious, only with a few repairs needed in a room or two, and the price the owner was giving him was much lower than he had expected it to be. However, my father couldn't shake off the feeling he had as soon as my sister entered the house. The atmosphere felt heavy and so wrong. Add to the fact that Giselle had seemed reluctant to enter the house and was no longer looking around, but constantly turned to look over her shoulder. As the tour of the house progressed, my father saw that Giselle's unease had melted into complete and utter terror, her face extremely pale, that he thought at one point she was going to faint, and she practically had his arm in a death grip. Giselle, however, refused to say a word when he asked what was wrong, just shaking her head and practically gluing herself to his side as she trembled. My father knew just by the terrified look on Giselle's face that buying that house would be a mistake. Once the tour was over, my father informed the owner that they wouldn't be buying the house, as tempting as the low price was, but thanked him for his time. When my father and Giselle were in the car, he noticed how her eyes were fixed on one of the windows on the 2nd floor, and because he knew that she could see something he couldn't, he asked her what was wrong. My sister tore her dark eyes away from whatever she had been looking at, before turning to him still terrified. "Dad?" Her normally high-pitched voice was barely a whisper. "There was a woman in black following us around while we were going through the house. She was floating, and she had a black veil over her head, but I could see her face. It was white, so white, and her eyes, they were pure black, but at the same time, blazing with hatred. And she had a snarl on her face and followed us at a distance, but stopped at the foyer after you and I stepped out the door. She was watching us from one of the windows on the 2nd floor just now. She was just filled with hate." My father had started driving as Giselle spoke, and he felt a chill run down his spine once she finished. They didn't bother looking at any other houses that day, despite my father having listed 4 more to look at, because he told me that what Giselle had told him rattled him more than he wanted to admit, and he felt quite drained. I don't even want to think about what would have happened if they'd have brought that house. The next story was told to me by my parents and takes place in a building that my parents and I were residing in shortly after I was born. It seems the building was quite haunted, and they had only learnt about it after moving in. All the people residing there had their own stories to tell. It was just before lunch on the day my parents brought me back from the hospital, and I was asleep in my mother's arms. Just as soon as my parents stepped in their flat and were about to insert the key into the lock, they were startled when something collided with the door, barely missing my father's head. The noise jolted me from my sleep and I began to wail. They whipped their head towards the winding staircase that led to the upper floors, and my father ran to the foot of the stairs to see who had thrown the dirt, but there was no one about, and they would have heard someone running on the tiled floor, or any of the doors slamming, but it was completely silent since it was a weekday and the neighbors were at work. After ushering my mother inside, my father took a look at what had nearly struck him, and saw it was a ball of dirt, compacted perfectly into shapes, as if someone had taken the time to form it and harden it with their hand before hurling it in his direction. My father took a gardening trowel and scooped it up, before showing it to my mother, who was trying to comfort me since I was still crying up a storm. When the neighbors arrived from work several hours later, they saw my father standing at the foot of the stairs looking up. They asked what was wrong, and he proceeded to tell them the events of the day and showed them the ball of dirt that had caused the fuss. Little things would happen as the months went by. Some that were harmless, others not so. Sometimes when my father was at work and my mother was carrying me as she moved about the house, she noticed how I kept shifting in her arms and laughing, as if there was someone playing peekaboo with me, even though she knew that we were the only ones there. Other times she would hear me squealing with delight in my crib when she had her back to me, and when she turned around, I would be reaching into the air as if trying to grab something. One night, while both my parents were laying in bed, gazing at me as I slept between them, they heard the unmistakable sound of someone walking into the bedroom and stopped outside the door. They heard the unmistakable sound of the doorknob rattling, as if someone was trying to get in, but the door was locked. The rattling stopped, only to be followed by a light knocking. My father turned on the bedroom light, demanding to know who it was. The knocking stopped and there was only silence. Nothing else happened that night. However, neither of my parents got any sleep. The next morning they checked all the doors and windows, and everything was locked. We moved out of that place that same weekend. When I was 5, me and my identical twin sister both caught scarlet fever. We are from America, but my dad's project had temporarily relocated us to India, and we were not used to the water and food there. We both fell into a coma towards the end of the fever. One day, I woke up, and my mum and aunt were screaming and crying and holding my sister because she was unresponsive and not breathing. They were doing chest compressions, CPR and the like, but nothing was working. I was desperately trying to get their attention because I was young and didn't understand what was going on. I went back to my room to go back to sleep, but in the corner of my room where my sister's bed was, I saw her laying there breathing fine. I went back out to the living room and realized I was looking at myself in my mum's arms as she tried to revive me. Eventually I saw my eyes flicker open, and then everything went dark. I woke up a few weeks later in the hospital next to my sister and my mum, who ended up catching it because of us. My mum told me I had almost passed, and they were trying to wake me up, but I was unresponsive, so the ambulance took all 3 of us into the ICU. To this day, I'm still unsure how I witnessed my almost death. My parents own 2 bars in my small town. Above this particular establishment, there are 2 apartment buildings, with only one being rented out at this time. His name was Damon, and in all aspects of the way he was a perfect tenant. He always paid his rent on time. He kept to himself. He never caused any trouble, and was overall a laid-back kind of guy. He was a beloved member of our inner circle, but his girlfriend was not. Amber was wild, with a short temper. Even with a crowded bar below, her screams could be heard throughout the building. She broke multiple locks on the door from bursting in. The cops were called once a week, and everyone was feeling worse and worse for Damon. But he loved her. He never left her. Maybe that's why everyone loved Damon so much. He was truly about seeing the good in people. The more these events would occur, the less we would see of Damon. He stopped coming down for drinks after work. He never played dance with his friends anymore, and his rent kept coming in late. Religiously. This wasn't Damon. My father kept trying to get to the bottom of the situation with no avail. Something didn't feel right, and that's because it wasn't. It was a busy morning for lunch when the incident came to light. My father was behind the bar when Amber comes running in screaming and crying. She doesn't know how, or why, or what's going on, because she found Damon shot in the head. He had allegedly ended his own life the night before, after the bar closed down. My father proceeded to call 911 and rung up to the apartment to see if it was truly what happened. It did. My father says to this day he thinks about it still and gets physically sick because it was so sorrowful. Damon truly deserved all the love in the world, and if anyone who's hearing this right now, please have a moment of silence for him and anyone who you know is struggling. Maybe we wanted to believe it, or it was true, but since then every single waitress has had an experience. Even ones who never knew him are feeling some sort of presence. Maybe it's some kind of lingering energy. Maybe late at night, our eyes play tricks on us. Or maybe it's Damon watching out. The experiences are never aggressive. If anything, they are thoughtful and comical. Almost once a week, the Bush light tap handle will pour itself the same beer he drank. The doors will already be locked when we go to close up one night, and sometimes the lights will just shut off by themselves, but only at closing time and never during the day. I understand that these things can be explained away. It's an old building, but multiple bartenders have seen a figure of a man before, including me. And this is one of the things I can't explain, and it happened a month ago. It was 2 a.m. I was closing everything in the dining room down, turned off the TVs and swept the floor. Attached to the dining room is a deck leading outside with 2 large glass double doors separating the area. When I turned around to sweep the carpet in front of the doors, I saw the dark figure of what looked to be a person. I was startled, not because I thought it was paranormal, but because it looked like someone was on the deck watching me, and I'm supposed to be all alone. I quickly opened the door, furious because this person really freaked me out. And FYI, we're closed, dude. You don't have to go home, but you can't hang out on my deck. But no one was hanging out on the deck. In fact, there wasn't a single car in the parking lot. I was utterly and completely alone. I agree with sound logic at this point. I freaked myself out, that's all, until I walked back into the dining room. I closed the door behind me, and when I go turn around to lock, I look into the reflection of the glass, and I see the figure. I turned, shocked, tears already in my eyes because I don't know this person. Who's in here with me? And the answer was no one. The figure wasn't there. And when I looked back into the reflection of the window, it was gone as well. I called my dad immediately. I never finished sweeping or any of my other nightly chores and got the hell out of there. The next morning, my father went to open business up and found the basement door broken into and half the cooler ransacked. When looking back at the security footage, 2 men are seen breaking into the door using a crowbar and loading up a truck, and we got the license plate, thankfully. When we checked the timestamp, it said 3:06 a.m. That's when I started to panic. If I wouldn't have gotten so scared of what I saw, I would have still been there. It takes a good hour to clean and close down from a shift. No doubt in my mind, I would have been there. Something inside tells me it's luck, but a larger part of me wants to believe that was Damon, and that he's still here in some way looking out for the girls like he always had. I was 13 years old. We lived in Lowell, Indiana. Our house was built in the 1800s, antebellum style, and huge. It always creeped me out. From the very day we moved in, I was aware that we weren't alone in that house. The house itself had 7 bedrooms. I had 3 sisters and 1 brother, although we had plenty of rooms to have our own. We paired up. I shared a room with my older sister, and my younger twin sisters had their room together. I will now share with you two of the most frightening experiences I had when I lived there. The first one before we decided that we would rather have a roommate than be alone. It was around the first month or so of us living there. I had trouble falling asleep to begin with, and it was summer, but I remember it being extremely cold in my room. So cold that I shivered and rolled onto my side to curl up under my blankets. Finally, I fell asleep, but I awoke and my skin was ice cold. My blanket was missing. I didn't think much of it, so I looked over to the right side of my bed on the floor, then to my left. Nothing. The hair stood up on the back of my neck as I crawled to the foot of my bed and saw my blanket laying perfectly flat, like someone had taken it off me in the middle of the night and laid it out on the floor. Absolutely no wrinkles in it. I actually don't recall how I reacted. I just know that it creeped me out so much that I moved into my big sister's room on the second floor that very night. The second incident that really stood out, and still does confuse me, was we had a horseshoe driveway and a security light in our front yard. During the summers, we always kept our windows up, as it stayed cool enough due to the light breeze and fresh air. One night, really late, the doorbell, which was extremely loud, rang. I got up and looked out the window down to my Aunt Kathy, who was standing there with my cousins Steve and Jessica. I could see them from their headlights, and it was pouring rain like a monsoon, which I also saw thanks to the headlights. I yelled down, "Hey, you guys okay?" "Yeah, can you let us in?" she replied. Me and Keith are fighting again. "Yeah, let me wake up my mum," I reply. So I wake her up, and she firmly says, as a matter of factly, "Well, let them in." I ran around the banister, down the 27 stairs to the foyer, and opened the door. There was no one there. No car, no rain, nothing. Just a warm breeze and the scaredest I've ever been in my entire life. I'm not sure if any of you know about these things, but can anyone explain what happened to me? I'm not the only one who witnessed it. My sister and my mum were both awake, and my sister was looking out the window as well as me. I always wondered what it was I let into my house. Like, what was it that rang the doorbell pretending to be a loved one in trouble? It's like whatever it was knew that we'd open the door if someone we loved was in trouble. Insidious is how it felt. At the time, when I looked down from the second-story window at my aunt Kathy, cousin Stevie, and Kathy holding baby Jessica on her hips. Jessica wasn't born yet, but this is what shakes me too. I told my mum, "Aunt Kathy, Stevie, and baby Jessica are here." At the time, Kathy was only 3 months pregnant. My husband and I bought a townhouse back in September of 2017, and we've had super weird things happen since. Most of these experiences have happened on our second story. For background, where the stairs come up to my office is immediately to the left. Then there is a long hall to the right with the hallway bathroom. The laundry room just past that is my son's room on the other side, and the master bedroom at the very end of the hall. The access to the attic is in the master bedroom closet. As our family goes, it's me, my husband, our son, and our 2 large dogs. When we first moved in, our son was barely 3 years old and had just started making full sentences. He would be playing all day without any issues, but whenever it started to get dark outside, he began getting nervous and wouldn't want to be in his room. He'd come downstairs at one point saying, "Mummy, do you hear it?" "Hear what, kiddo?" "The baby's crying, Mummy." My son is an only child, so you can imagine my confusion at this time. I came upstairs with him and asked him where he was hearing it from, thinking he may be hearing the neighbors through the wall. He took my hand and pulled me towards the master bedroom, stopping just a short over the threshold. He pointed to the darkest corner of the room and said, "Over there. The baby's crying over there." My body went numb. I tried to brush it off and told him there's no baby there and he's just imagining it. This persisted for about a month before he finally stopped talking about the crying baby. During this time I had been doing research on our house, and there had been no deaths in that house that I could find, let alone any kids that lived in the house before us. A few weeks after my son stopped mentioning the baby, I started hearing scratching noises above my head in the attic. I told my husband and he thought we had raccoons or some other animal living in the attic. He went up a few days later, but found nothing. I'm normally a heavy sleeper, but at least twice a week I would wake up to hear a faint scratching noise directly above me. I did my best to try and ignore it and go back to sleep. This seemed to work, as we hadn't had an issue for a while up until recently. I have always felt somewhat uneasy on the second floor, but I just attributed it to my past paranormal experiences growing up and being a little paranoid. Now, I'm thinking my senses were on point. A few months ago, my husband and I were talking about how our son had this weird affinity for the crying baby when he was younger, and I had mentioned that one day when I was taking a nap, I woke up abruptly, being sideways on the bed with one leg hanging off towards the closet, almost like I was being dragged towards it. However, I don't remember being pulled at all. All I do is flop around a lot in my sleep, so I brushed it off. After I told my husband about this, he frowned a little bit and said he had a weird experience too recently. Apparently, he woke up one morning around 2:30 a.m. and saw a figure standing by his side of the bed. He said it was all black, and he couldn't really make out a face or any distinct features. He went to kick the figure, thinking maybe someone had broken into the house, and his foot went right through it. This freaked him out a little bit, but he's a firm believer that if you don't acknowledge paranormal things, they can't do anything. So of course he rolls over and goes to sleep, and doesn't even think to mention it to me until I told him about my own experience. The whole time we've been here, the dogs will randomly get spooked or will stare at something that I don't see. Every once in a while, our wolf hybrid, who's typically scared of his own shadow, will get very upset, and his hair will stand on end, and he will emit a low but vicious growl. Our other dog is a Malinois/Black Lab mix, but she's getting old and is 10 years old now, and doesn't really do much other than sleep on her bed and try to get all the pets and treats from us. And this brings us to the present. Yesterday there was a decent storm that came through our area. It was semi-dark out, and thunder every once in a while. I'm working from home during the virus pandemic, and my mum had come to pick up my son around 11:30 so that I could work in peace without my son continually bothering me. A few hours later, I'm listening to a podcast while working, and I hear a faint mumble that almost sounded like, "Mummy?" The chilling thing is that it sounded exactly like my son. I turned around to tell him that he needed to go back to his room and not bother me while I was working. But as I was turning, I remembered he wasn't even home. I was here alone with the dogs. There was no one behind me, and no one down the hall. At this point, I try to brush it off, thinking my mind is playing a trick on me, when my wolf hybrid starts losing it. All his hair stands on end. He gets between me and the door and starts doing this low growl. This freaked me out a little bit, but I told him to stop, which he listened to, and laid back down but without taking his eyes off the hallway. About an hour later, I was in the zone with work, and was talking to a co-worker on our team chat. They sent me something funny enough to make me audibly laugh. I then heard a tiny giggle that sounds exactly like my son, coming from his room down the hall, who still isn't home at this point. I nearly fall out of my chair with how scared I was. I got up and checked all the rooms upstairs, but I was home alone like I had thought. I had to get back to work as we were starting to get busy, but I was on edge and straining to hear if anything else was happening behind me. 10 minutes later, I hear the crash of something relatively small but still loud downstairs. My dogs run down the steps while I follow behind them. My PlayStation controller, which was originally on the charging stand behind the TV, was in the middle of the living room floor. This made my blood run cold, as we had not had anything physically moved yet, and I was having a full-blown panic attack. I called my husband, who was already on his way home, and said he would be there soon. When he got home, everything seemed to have stopped. This all happened from 2 to 4:30 in the middle of a little thunderstorm. I've looked into it, and from what I can gather, when something can mimic voices, it's typically evil or demonic. Should I be worried? What do I do in this situation? I don't want to scare my son, and we can't move, but I'm extremely paranoid and scared to be home alone right now. I'm a native of Long Island, New York, which, as you may know, has been settled for a long time and has a lot of little old towns, especially on the eastern end of the island. We even have some Revolutionary War history. At the time of this story, I was seeing a guy from the local area, and one night he took me to a bar called the Checkmate Inn in Setterket, because some friends of his worked there, and it was supposed to be this cool old local spot with a few interesting stories. It used to be a private home and sits on a barely lit single-lane road winding through rows of tall trees. It actually still looks like an old house, and even has a cellar where they store the alcohol. Its second story has been converted into some apartments above the bar area, and staff sometimes rent them out. Across the street from the Checkmate is the Thompson House, an old wooden structure built in 1709, belonging to a doctor during the Revolutionary War, and is now a museum of colonial medicine. We got there before the big rush of customers showed up, and we were able to talk with one of his buddies who tended the bar that evening. Somehow the subject of ghost stories came up. My date's buddy told me that he'd rented one of the upstairs apartments and had some weird experiences up there. There had been a few nights when he'd awoken at 3 a.m. to see a shadow standing on the opposite side of the bedroom, or being alone in the apartment at night and hearing footsteps passing through the other rooms. Having glass beer bottles suddenly slide off the kitchen table and crash to the floor, or witnessing his bedroom curtains waving wildly as if blown by a strong wind, only to find that the windows were closed and locked. One night he woke up in the darkness to see an old man leaning over his bed, looking furiously angry. Thinking someone had broken in, he yelled at the man and sat up, but in that moment the man vanished. His brother had worked at the bar and rented one of the apartments before him as well, and reportedly saw not only the shadowy figure of an old man, but also what appeared to be a young woman in a pale dress in his bedroom at night. He never got a good look at her face, though. Apparently the brother's girlfriend had stayed there with him overnight a few times, and had seen the woman as well. The bartender had worked at the Checkmate for about a year at that time, and while he no longer rented the apartment there, he continued to have strange things happen to him while on the job. The most active part of the building was the old cellar. He said it's very dark and cool down there, and several times he'd gone down to grab another keg of beer or bottles of liquor, and had bottles flung at him when he was the only one down there. He'd also been pushed on the stairs while carrying bottles once. His co-workers also told stories of having an uneasy feeling in the cellar, and having kegs rolled across the room suddenly, or having bottles thrown at them. When they went to confront whoever was on shift with them at the time, they were always in another part of the building and denied playing jokes. He wasn't sure about the history of the house or whether anyone had passed away there, though. The home is from the mid-1800s, so I'm not sure if it had many owners through the years. Well, I love ghost stories, and so did my date. We didn't find them so much scary as thought-provoking and entertaining. We enjoyed the rest of our night and went to leave at about 2:30 in the morning. Most of the patrons had left at that point, with just 2 or 3 stragglers hanging out on the back deck. We each had driven ourselves to the bar, and I had parked on the side of the road in front of the old Thompson house. We stood in front of the house talking for several minutes, and then shared a long kiss. Suddenly, both of us were startled by a very loud thump right next to us. We pulled apart, and I started looking around for what could have made the noise. A few feet away, rolling towards the road, was a huge rock, almost the size of a cantaloupe. I was trying to be brave and picked it up. It must have weighed 5 or 6 pounds. I was pissed, thinking one of his friends at the bar had thrown it at us as an incredibly mean and unfunny joke. No one was around, and as we had been standing around for a while, we would have seen anybody crossing the road. The checkmate is set about 100 yards from the road, and then off to the side is the patio. If someone had thrown it from across the street, they'd have to have been a shot-put champ to hurl a 6-pound rock almost 200 yards. And even then, why was the rock bouncing quickly towards the road? None of the few remaining bar patrons had moved from their seats, and no one was up or moving around on the other side of the road. It looked as if it had been thrown from the direction of the dark woods surrounding the Thompson house. I walked around the property expecting to find someone hiding in the bushes, but I didn't see or hear anything. Neither of us had seen or heard anyone walking around. It was a still night on a quiet road, and unable to come up with an explanation, we were both pretty freaked out and decided that was our cue to leave. Something around there was clearly not happy with PDA. I'm no longer seeing the guy, as I haven't gone back there since. But one day, when the COVID lockdown is over, I'd like to go back and see if any of the current bar staff have any new stories to tell. Besides, it's a fun local bar and a good spot for a low-key night out. Next story. I now live in Northern Virginia, and as it so happens, the Gettysburg battlefield is only about an hour-and-a-half drive away from where I currently reside. If you've ever heard the stories, the battlegrounds and the surrounding neighborhoods are supposed to be extremely haunted. They have some fantastic ghost tours there, and the town and battlefields have their own sort of aura about them. Even without hearing the stories, I went on a ghost tour one night with a friend of mine. At one point in the tour, we arrived at a creek on the edge of town. The story as told by our guide was that on the second day of the battle, a group of wounded Union soldiers had taken refuge in the creek bed, which was dry in the middle of summer. Many of them were badly injured and unable to move. Unfortunately, the summer storm came through and it began to rain heavily, flooding the creek bedding and drowning all of the wounded men. Not one of them survived, according to the tale. Well, it was nighttime when I stood there, and pitch black. I hung back as the tour group moved on to their next stop and looked around. There's a lot of long grasses and cattails growing along the creek now, and I decided just for the fun of it to take some pictures of them in the dark. I had flash on, and of course I made sure that there was no one in front of me or around me at the time. I really didn't expect anything, but figured why not. The next day, as I got home, I was looking through my tour photos, and in one of the pictures I had taken of the creek, you can see the reeds and cattails very clearly, lit up by the flash, floating above them, and the upper hand corner of the picture, dim but still very visible, was a face. It was the side view of a man's face, and you could easily make out a blue cap from the front of a blue-collared coat and yellow buttons. The forehead, eyes, nose, and parts of the chin, as well as what would appear to be dark hair under the cap, were very distinct. Remember again that this face is floating above the tall plants in the creek, and while not transparent, it does seem to be lit up by the flash. The two other photos I took of the same spot within seconds of each other had nothing on it. The blue military-looking coat and cap made me wonder if this could have been the apparition of a Union soldier, hanging around the spot where he'd tragically drowned. I showed the photo to a few people without pointing anything out to them, and every one of them immediately noticed the face. The third story here was told to me by a friend of mine who hails from Michigan. She was in a sorority during her undergrad years, and one of the sorority chapter houses had a ghostly legend attached to it. Apparently, a former sister had graduated and returned to the university years later as a professor. I'm not sure of the details, but her life was brutally ended in her home one night, and I don't think the killer was ever caught. Since then, the sorority house, where she had spent so much of her time of her life in, has been the site of disembodied footsteps, doors opening and closing, lamps turning on and off by themselves, and generally only when one of the sisters was alone in the house at night. She claims that many of the sisters she knew had experiences like this. One day, a visitor of one of the sorority's national councils came for a visit and stayed at the house. Not being from the local area, she decided to do some sightseeing in a nearby city and brought her GPS with her. This was several years ago, before everyone had a GPS on their phones. She had kept the GPS in her room at the sorority house that day and used it to navigate the city. On her way in, she experienced no problems and found her destination without difficulty. On her way home later that night, she plugged in the address to the house and soon noticed that her return route bore no resemblance to the one she'd taken earlier in the day. After many unfamiliar twists and turns, the GPS told her that she had arrived at her destination. The problem was she had not arrived at the sorority house, but a cemetery. After messing around with the device and re-entering the address, she finally found her way back to the sorority house and explained to one of the hosts what had transpired. Upon revealing the name of the cemetery, she was informed that it just so happened to be the one that the murdered former sister was buried in. Since I can remember, my mum saw things that no one else could, and knew things she couldn't ever have known. I'm not sure if I could call her a medium. To my knowledge, she's never actually tried to communicate with the dead. My mum never really liked to talk about it, and whenever I tried to talk about these things, she would quickly change the subject. However, she did tell me the spirits she sees or senses are all around us and are mostly neutral. The few instances of an evil presence she encountered scared her so much, she hoped that none of her children would have the same ability. I'm definitely not as sensitive as my mother. However, I do have a few strange experiences of my own. Today, I would like to share them with you. At the time I was around 15 years old. I live in Poland with my parents and two younger siblings in an apartment on the 4th floor. There was this older lady with some kind of mental disability living in the neighborhood. I never saw her before that day. She probably seldom left the house. That afternoon I was doing my hair in the bathroom when I heard noises coming from the apartment door. Someone was trying to get inside, knocking and pulling on the door handle. My stepdad and my siblings were at home with me, but my mom was out for some reason. I now do not remember. Thinking it may be her though, I opened the door. The moment I did, I saw an old, wrinkled lady with foggy eyes and grey hair try to push past me into the apartment. At that moment, I thought I saw a ghost. I stopped her by blocking the way with my body and asked how I could help her. She was visibly shaken, and her adult diaper was pulled down around her ankles. She began crying and yelling that her son is trying to kill her because she didn't want to give him money for alcohol. She said he grabbed her by the neck and attempted to strangle her. I looked over her shoulder, but I did not see anyone chasing her. As this was a bizarre situation, I really didn't know what to do, so I called out to my stepdad. He walked the old lady back home and told me later she's bipolar or something akin, and that she was probably just confused. I'm not sure what to do about it, as her son was indeed an alcoholic and the situation did not seem too implausible. My mum later told me the lady would sometimes come to our apartment thinking it was her place, as she lived in the neighbouring apartment block also on the 4th floor, but I never saw her again. Fast forward 2 years or so, I'm taking a shower, and suddenly I get this very weird sensation. I remember randomly the foggy-eyed old lady, and I knew that she had passed. As I got out the shower, the strange feeling lingered, and then all the toiletries and cosmetics began falling off the shelves. What was really weird is that some just fell straight down to the ground and some flew in different directions. If someone asked me before this incident what I would do if I saw things moving on their own, I probably would have said I would have noped out of there in a second and never come back. But I was not scared. I started calmly picking up everything and putting it back in place, and as I exited the bathroom, my mum entered the apartment with bags full of groceries. "Mum," I said, following her into the kitchen, "you'll probably think there's something wrong with me, but do you remember the old lady with glaucoma who came over here once yelling that her son was trying to kill her?" "Yeah, I do," she responded while unpacking the bags. "I think she just died," I said. My mum then turned towards me. "I don't think there's anything wrong with you." She paused for a moment, then continued. "There was a fire in the neighborhood as I was coming back from the supermarket. The firefighters were taking out the lady's body from the apartment. She probably fell asleep smoking or something and started the fire. Her son wasn't home." I looked at her with my mouth open without saying a word. Her eyes turned from my face to something behind me and back to me, and then she calmly added, "Don't be scared. She's here." I'm looking after my friend's 3 little girls tonight, while she works an overnight shift. Technically, it was last night, as it's now 2:30 a.m. Also, it's officially my 28th birthday. One for the books, let me tell you. The girls are 5, 6, and 8. My friend has a long history of paranormal activity that started when she was a kid, and now her children are starting to have some experiences, and they're scared. The 5-year-old was going on about her imaginary friend Summer tonight, who she's been talking to since she was 2. She says Summer isn't really imaginary, she's real, she's just not alive. She describes her in the exact same way every single time, and said she looks like wood. I have no idea why. My friend's daughter doesn't have an explanation for the wood thing either. She was talking to me about it tonight, and said she hasn't seen Summer in a long time, and she misses her. Her older sister of 8 doesn't like to hear it and freaks out. I got them off the subject and played guitar for them, and all was well for a few hours. Then the 5-year-old looks out the window leading to the balcony and says that she sees a ghost. I shrug it off, thinking it's just in her mind. The 6-year-old walks out to the window, turns around and looks me dead in the eyes with a look of horror, one that I've never seen on such a child. The 8-year-old proceeds to go out as well. So I'm over here like, "Guys, you're getting yourself worked up." And that's when I look out the window. The expression, "You look like you've just seen a ghost," is exactly what I think my face looked like. I was frozen. It was standing on the balcony across from us, and it was massive, like a giant. If that were just a person, it would have been the largest person on the earth. I told the girls to back away, and I went outside. I couldn't really see much of her face, just the figure. and you could tell it was staring at us. 8-year-old comes back over, and I'm making up some stuff about how it's shadows, and she's like, "No, it's moving." And it was. It moved its arms and head in the most unnatural way possible. Everything was wrong about it. My stomach was in knots. I got the girls to go into the living room and went into mum mode, as they are my priority, and I didn't have a second to worry about anything else. After they chilled, I kept going back to the window, and there it was, staring and moving its limbs a little bit. Eventually they fell asleep on the couch while watching a movie, and I snuck back out to check on things, and it was gone. Writing this out makes me feel crazy, and I wish I had another adult with me to confirm what I saw. But I know what I saw. It couldn't have just been a neighbor. It couldn't have. It was way too big to be human. It moved in ways I've never seen people move, and sent a chill down my spine. The 6-year-old woke up scared, and is in the master bedroom sleeping, and I'm sitting on this balcony, staring at the one across from me, waiting for this thing to appear. Nothing else happened. Nothing else needed to happen. I know what I saw, and it was like nothing I've ever seen in my life. At this point, I'll know I'll be up all night. It made me so uncomfortable, and more importantly, I wanted to be aware of everything so that I could protect the kids. I feel crazy right now. If anyone could shed any light on it, I would be very grateful. I'd also like to add that when Britt, my friend, and the mother of the girls got home, I immediately told her what had happened, and she went through the many stages of, "What the hell?" She looked at me and said, "You didn't happen to take a photo, did you?" My mouth dropped open. I couldn't even find the words. All I could think about was, how could I not even think to take one? I just didn't. It was the furthest thing from my mind at the time. When I first saw this thing, shock completely took over. I stood there, the girls at my side, completely still staring at this figure. I couldn't move, breathe. I just froze. Once I snapped out of it, my number one priority was to protect the kids and to get my stuff together. I bounced back between fear and frozen to keep the kids safe, never once considering taking one. Now that it's been brought to my attention again and again, I've wondered what I'd do if I did see it once more. Honestly, I don't know if I would want to take a picture, because it would be proof, and while that's a very good reason, I'm not sure it's worth it. I don't know what this figure is, and I'm scared. I can't say what I will or won't do if there's a next time. The first real paranormal experience I had was when I was 24 years old, and the year was 2002. My husband and I were living in a rental house that we moved into in late October of 2001. The house always gave me that weird feeling that I was being watched. I was working a part-time job 4 hours a day, Monday through Friday, and I would get off work around 1:30 p.m. My husband worked a full-time position with his hours all over the place. You could say that I was home alone a lot. We had a German Shepherd, chocolate Labrador mix named Bearclaw. He was a smart dog and very happy, and always by my husband or my side. Let me explain the layout of the house before I continue with the story. When you walk into the living room, there was a bedroom off to the left. Straight ahead is the dining room. The second bedroom is also to the left in the dining room, and we had a Jack and Jill bathroom between the two bedrooms. Off the dining room is the kitchen, and through the kitchen was a family room with a sliding door, and to the backyard and a half bath. The whole house was a hardwood floor, with a crawl space underneath the house. There were no carpets in the house except for the family room, so you had to walk across the floor, and you can hear footsteps. And the floor would creak because it's uneven. Bearclaw loved being outside, but when he was in the house he would never leave the family room. Bearclaw would stand at the doorway watching me in the living room and cry when I was alone in the house, but he wouldn't cry when my husband was there. I had a hard time walking through the kitchen. The air was heavy in there and my skin would crawl. It got to the point that when my husband left for work, I would walk to my mother's and father's house, which was 3 blocks away. Skipping to March 2002, it was late. My husband and I were asleep in a full-size bed. It was small and cramped, but my husband and I loved to cuddle, so we were okay with it. It's also essential to know that we had no bed frame, so the box spring and mattress sat on the floor. We had a duck lamp that gave off a strange orange glow that I used for a nightlight, because I've always been afraid of the dark. It was a hot night, and I could not sleep because of the heat. I would take my blanket off too to cool down, but then it got too cold, so I covered it back up. It was too hot to cuddle. My husband and I were both lying on our backs, shoulder to shoulder, him fast asleep, which I found odd as my husband does not take heat well. I finally got to the point that I just stuck my left foot out and handed over the covers and hung them on both ends of the bed. My body temperature was just starting to stabilize, and I felt I could finally go to sleep. I closed my eyes, and as I do, I hear someone step into the room with a loud creak sound. My heart jumped to my throat. I tried to open my eyes to see who came into the room, and to my surprise I couldn't open them. I didn't understand what was going on. Just then, I felt a large, skinny, cold hand grabbed my ankle and then my wrist. I went to yell for my husband, but I could only scream in my head. My heart was beating faster and I was being pulled off the bed. I then went to grab my left wrist, and whoever had a hold of it, but I couldn't move my arm. I kept trying to call for my husband and trying to move my right hand, and finally my right hand moved and grabbed my left wrist. But there was no one grabbing me. Then my eyes pop open, and there was no one there, and I was partially off the bed. I crawled back onto the bed and under the covers. I got so close to my husband that I'm nearly laying on him, but I was so scared I didn't go to sleep till the next morning sun shined through the bedroom windows. When I finally got up next day, I told my husband what happened to me. He said that he thought he felt me being pulled away slowly, like from him, like I was being dragged. Then he felt me put my arm around him. In the following weeks, I found a thing called sleep paralysis. You know, that frightening state that a person finds themselves in when they're unable to move. It's due to an irregularity in passing between sleep stages and wakefulness. I then asked him how this could be sleep paralysis if I found myself partially pulled off the bed. I could still feel the hands around my wrists and ankles the following next few days. He pulled out a book about supernatural creatures and read me one about a beast called the night hag or the old hag. A short explanation is a supernatural creature that's used to explain sleep paralysis. The phenomenon happens to a sleeping person who's on their back. The person feels a presence and the person can't move, and then they feel the person sitting on their chest and they can't breathe, or they feel the creature sit on the foot of the bed. I don't know if that was it, but I know that it wasn't sleep paralysis. Since that day, I've seen and heard things that others can't. A few weeks after that night, I found out I was pregnant with our first child. I thought just maybe whatever it was wanted my unborn baby. To this day, when I think about that night, I can still feel 2 large, thin, cold hands on my wrists and ankles, like it's a mark that was given to me that opens the doors to the supernatural. I just wish I could give it back. This story happened to me all throughout my life. In any case, let's jump to the first experience. My mum had just gotten to me into Michael Jackson back in 2003, when she got me his #1 hit records. I had a 6 CD stereo with a remote in my room, and I fell asleep listening to the music. One night I was listening and Thriller was on. This had the Vincent Price ending, and at the end of the song, a door squeaks when it's closing. My closet was almost an entire wall, and it was 2 side doors. Well, the song ended, and I saw one of my closet doors push out and close, making a similar song. I ran downstairs and told my mum and her ex. They assured me it was my mind just playing tricks on me. They walked up to my room with me, checked the closet to put me back in bed. A few months later, I was laying in bed trying to get to sleep. I used to keep my bedroom door open for the light in the bathroom. But my mum and her ex got me a lava lamp since they were trying to lower the light bill. It's around midnight, a school night. My lava lamp is on. My stereo is playing a local radio station at a low volume, and I'm staring at my door as I try to drift off to sleep. I saw a figure walk through my door. She had a pink aura. It wasn't bright, but I knew it was a lady, and she was a bit on the heftier side, and I could tell from her facial features that she was middle-aged and dark-skinned. She was walking towards me, slowly, and I was frozen in fear. So I put the blankets over my head and kept them there for the rest of the night. I fell asleep at one point, waking up to my alarm clock. I never told my mum or boyfriend about this experience, and I was very reluctant to tell my mum's boyfriend because he always comes off as one to chalk things up to being my imagination. My second experience was quite a while later. I was 18. I was in my room watching Step Brothers when I hear a slight knock. I had no idea if it was coming from the movie or not, and I thought it could have been my sister or mum wanting to come in and talk to me. I rewinded the movie and heard no knock, so I opened my door and saw the ghost again. She was at the bottom of the steps and was turning the corner to go downstairs. I wasn't scared, for at this point I had been really into the paranormal and she meant no harm. Or so I thought. A few months after this, my friend came over, and we were in my room talking about the paranormal. When the topic of ghosts comes up, I tell her my experiences and start stupidly mocking the ghost I had seen twice. I say she won't come out and show herself and that she's too scared to do so. My friend leaves and I go to bed at some point, and wake up the next day with scratches that start from my right ankle around my leg twice and up to my inner thigh. My leg was really sore. The line was perfectly intact and there's no way I could have done it in my sleep. I pondered on what it could have been, and I can vividly remember looking around my room and saying, "I'm sorry for mocking you. I won't do it again." Those 3 experiences are pretty far apart, but between them I've had some unexplained stuff happen. Our house phone illuminates at night, and at one point the upstairs bathroom toilet didn't flush. Walking down the steps and into the kitchen, then downstairs to use the bathroom, I can look to see the time on the phone as I'm walking into the bathroom. I can remember it was between 3:30 and 3:45. I was in the bathroom for a while, and when I walk out I go check the time on the phone. But it wasn't on the charger. It was about 7 feet away on the table. I could chalk it up to my mum or her ex because they slept in the living room, but they rarely ever woke up in the middle of the night. And even so, why grab the phone so late? The TV was off and I'd hear them if they were up. I've heard steps in the downstairs room, the tables and chairs not being in the same place just seconds after seeing them in another spot. I even had my first and only episode of sleep paralysis, which was nothing too horrifying, just unable to move, breathe, and open my eyes for 15 seconds. Nothing scary. We had 2 dogs, and one stayed inside and one stayed outside and in the garage. And there are times when the inside one would stop what he was doing and just stare at a wall or corner. Sometimes he'd bark, and other times he'd give off a low growl. My mum worked at a college for a long time, and there was a foreign exchange student from the UK. We became very close. We'd often stay together, and my mum's ex and the student and I were watching The Exorcist and got to talking about stuff. By this time I didn't care what my mum's ex thought of my experiences, and I told them the things that had happened. As I'm explaining, I don't go into the details of the ghost outside and how she had a pink aura, and my mum's ex kept asking if it was a dark lady on the heavier side. At one point I told him it was, and finished my story. When I was done, I told him that he probably didn't believe me, and he said he did. What he said next, though, sent chills down my spine. He said he was good friends with the former house owner. He got it way before we moved in, and the former house owner died in the living room after having a heart attack. He purchased the house soon after her untimely death, and told me her name was Ernestine, and she had pink curtains, pink rug, and her favorite color was pink. I never doubted or put my experiences off to my imagination, because I've had some odd things happen at my grandma's house before we moved in with my mom's ex. But this sold me that the house was being watched over by her, and she'd taken a liking to me, despite me mocking her that one time. I had been experiencing many strange sounds and feelings last year. My cousin had a party at my house, and without my knowledge, had brought a Ouija board and played it. Keep in mind that my room is in the basement, and every sound in the house can be heard from there. Most of the time I can tell exactly what it is. It was just me, my mum and sister, and 2 dogs in the house. I'd been hearing loud footsteps all around the house, mostly when it was just me home, and they were heavy, like a man's footsteps. Too heavy to be my mum or my sister, and I began to smell this rancid smell floating around the house. I'll be downstairs cleaning the basement, and it'll pass by me so suddenly, I had actually thought I made it up. Then I'd be anywhere else in the house, and I'll just settle for a few minutes, and it'll pass by once again. This strange occurrence happened for several weeks. Then it progressed to random objects flying off the shelves at one point, and a cup almost hit me as I was walking past my bookshelf. 2 months after the first incident, I started seeing a dark, shadowy silhouette in the basement just across from my room. Now, I'm not one that scares easily, but after so many weeks of these incidents, I had increasingly become more and more paranoid, and so seeing it for the first time, I was so scared. I couldn't shut my door fast enough. It was like that every night, seeing it in the same spot. Soon enough, I began to see it all around my house, down the hallway, in the dining room, and despite being afraid, I tried to ignore it, because if I didn't feed into what it wanted, it couldn't hurt me, or so I thought. About 2 to 3 weeks after seeing it for the first time, I had woken up with a scabbing and scratching sensation down my back. Slight bruising as well. That was the only case of there ever being anything physical. Sometime after that, I had a dream involving the entity. In the dream, I was standing on the dock, watching the water, when I noticed a child standing at the end of it. The little boy fell in, and I had run to him, jumping in the water after him. But all I saw was the child being dragged under. Only its eyes were dark and hollow. It was like big pools of dark ink. Then as I'm trying to grab for him, I had this feeling of dread. Then I'm grabbed and faced with the same entity. Only this time I can actually see its face, pale and white, with the same black eyes like empty sockets. Its face stuck in this silent scream. As I woke up, I had sleep paralysis and started going through some of the steps I have to do to get out of it. After that, the incident slowly died away, until finally I had a friend of mine cleanse the house and do a blessing. Ever since then, I haven't had any more occurrences. I'm just not sure how to make sense of all of this. My sister, age 12, recently came to me and described feeling uncomfortable in certain areas of the house, and said she'd been seeing the same dark silhouette of the same woman that I used to see. She also has been having nightmares of this entity watching her sleep and following her around. I still have not had any more experiences. I was wondering what anyone thought about why she's suddenly being affected after so long. My mum has this big stand thing where we put hand creams and face masks, and it's about an inch away from the counter closet to the toilet. Sometimes when I use the toilet, it falls over on top of me. I have one of those lamps with about 5 heads, and the shades are all different colors in my room for extra light. Sometimes when I'm sleeping, I wake up to a loud bang. I open my eyes and my lamp is lying on the floor. My little brother of 1 has a toy piano, where as long as you just touch the keys it plays. Often I wake up to that piano playing. My siblings are at daycare, and my mum is at work all the time. I wake up and I'm alone. I always turn it off. None of my siblings play with it, and it only happens when I'm alone. I have a white heat lamp for my geckos, but we haven't used one in a few weeks. Every time we screw in a brand new light bulb and turn on the lamp, the bulb will shatter. We've checked 1,000 times that we're using the right bulb wattage for the right heat lamp. We even bought a new lamp and the bulbs will still explode. If anyone has any explanation for this, please tell me. I'm also scared to use the bathroom and scared to fall asleep. My uncle grew up in an old Scottish house that came with the job of gamekeeper for the reservoir it was next to. It's a large place, even having a turret and battlements on one corner. My uncle would always tell me of the time he saw the grey lady standing in the doorframe of his room. My uncle grew up extremely terrified of the dark for that very reason, and this in itself went a long way for the family believing it was true. Fast forward to about a decade ago. The family are all up in Scotland again, revisiting places of their childhood. And then we happened to go near the old house. We ended up knocking on the door and kindly the owner agreed to let us tour the old house. A bit of a nostalgia trip for my uncle's aunts and father. We came across old remainders of their time in this house, such as scratching the favourite football teams on the inside of a cupboard. We ended up asking them about more paranormal things, and the conversation ended up going like this. So have you heard of the house being haunted at all? Oh yes, you must mean old Tam. He rattles around the tower occasionally. No, that doesn't sound right, it was more in the basement. Oh, the grey lady. By which point we all became very silent and left shortly after. I was never really sure growing up that my uncle was telling the truth or not, but this experience taught me to keep a very open mind. I lived in eastern Kentucky my whole life. I grew up way back in the holler, the last house on the road deep in the woods. I lived with my grandparents the majority of my childhood, and if I wasn't there, I was next door at my mum's house. Those woods have always given me a creepy feeling. I have felt stuff watch me. I have felt things touch me. I've seen stuff that I can't explain. When I lived with my grandparents, I would sleep with my mama. My papa slept in the other bedroom because they both snored really loudly and would keep each other up. My grandma's bed was right beside the window facing the woods. My side of the bed was right along next to the window. And in the summer, she would keep up the blinds and open the screen on the window and turn on the fan on high. Kentucky summers are extremely hot and humid. I remember many nights laying there and not being able to close my eyes because I would feel something watching me from the woods. I would lay there and stare into the darkness, hoping that I wouldn't see whatever it was and that it would go away. I would lay there for hours at a time. My whole family would see little small figures dart around the house, across the hall from bedroom to bedroom. My mum has witnessed a lot in this house. One morning my grandpa had taken my mama to work. She would go in at around 6:30 a.m. She never got her driving license, so my pup had always taken her to and from wherever she needed to go. My mom was getting ready for work that morning and thought Papa had come home from town. She said, "That was quick," but he didn't reply. She said she heard him rustling through the cabinets like he does every morning, working on making coffee, and she said she even heard him spit in his spit bottle. My papa had chewed tobacco for as long as I can remember. She heard the recliner being opened and went into the living room, but no one was home. She left for work as soon as possible after that. Living in the double-wide we had beside my grandma, I would sleep with my mum most of the time. The heat never circulated very well to the other side of the trailer for some reason, and in the winter it would get really cold. Her bed was facing the master closet and master bathroom, and my side of the bed faced the master bathroom. I can't tell you how many times I'd seen this, but I would see a woman sitting in the bathroom floor in the fetal position. She would be crying and would look up at me every now and then. I would tell my mum about it, but she would just tell me to go back to sleep. The nights I would sleep in my bedroom, I would see what looked like little trolls in my closet scampering around. I would shut the closet door, but by morning it would be ajar. That property, the woods and land, have something on it. May it be an Indian burial ground or whatever. But being up there after dark now as an adult, I still feel stuff watching me. Some stories my grandpa told me from the 50s. He's the super religious type. The type that if he's telling a story and he messes up one fact, he'll soon correct it and say, "Lord forgive me." So I know for a fact these are the God's honest truth. My papa grew up in a one-room house here in the country, not too far from where I grew up. Him and his brother, my uncle, were around 15 or 16 and were sitting on the back porch of their house just talking and laughing, probably drinking coffee. He swears on his life that up in the sky, maybe 500 feet, a 3-paneled door appeared, not in cloud form but an actual door. He said the door was white and had a small lit lantern at the bottom of the door. He watched it for hours as it just sat there. They could see the flame flickering in the lantern, and after a few hours it just completely disappeared. Another one he told me was about his dad, my great-grandpa and his dad, my great-great-grandpa, fishing with another father and son one night on the North Fork of the Kentucky River. They did this about once a week around midnight. Not sure why midnight, maybe better fishing? Anyway, they were heading back to town, upriver, and they started hearing a funeral hymn approaching. They stopped the boat on the riverbank and said that the boat was floating towards them with nothing but an old hickory casket in it. Sat there in amazement and scared to death. He said he could have reached out and touched it. That's how close it was. The other father and son said, "Well, I think that's sign for us to get home." I don't think they ever went fishing at night again. I've got several other stories that happened to me, and Eastern Kentucky certainly has a vast amount of paranormal activity if you look in the right places. I live in Japan, but I am American, so my language skills on both sides aren't too sharp. My spouse is Japanese, and we have one child together and decided to move to Japan. So once I moved to be with them, we waited a few years before we started going house hunting. I didn't want to live in the country, since that's where I lived my entire life and hated it, and also didn't want to live in a big city like Tokyo or Kyoto. We compromised and decided maybe returning to my husband's hometown would be best, so that way my in-laws could be involved with our son. I think everyone was pretty excited with my willingness to be closer to the family. We ended up finding a really amazing realtor who was very patient with my American demands. Wide open floor plan with 3 to 4 LDK, so bedroom, living room, dining room and kitchen. We went to see a couple of places. and in my mind, I'm pre-denying anything where my 5'1" self could jump up and touch the ceiling, or if I could touch both walls with my arms outstretched in a hallway. I know the realtor was exhausted with my demands, but he worked hard and found a brand new development with almost everything I wanted. There were 3 homes he wanted to show us, so we brought our son and my mother-in-law, who helped keep his attention while my husband and I spoke to the realtor. The first home was nice. High ceilings, enough room for our family, but not enough parking. We moved on to the next house just next door. This place wasn't up to my expectations. It was much smaller than the first with an awkward layout. While I looked around with my mother-in-law, we heard what sounded like hammering upstairs. She mentioned that since it was a new development, the contractors may be finishing up and cleaning upstairs. That's when I noticed my son had wandered off. I called out to him and he runs down the stairs screaming for his grandma and pulling her arm with urgency. Before I could tell him to behave, the realtor hears the same hammering sound. My husband asks if the contractors were still here because we wanted to take a look upstairs. He replied telling us no. Everything we were looking at today was basically ready to move in. And that's when my son started saying, "Crow, crow." Confused, we followed the realtor upstairs and found in the main bedroom several crows had been ramming themselves into the windows. They would perch up on the railing of the balcony, fly a short distance, then ram into the window with such force they would fall on the balcony and lay motionless for a moment, before attempting to do it again and cawing loudly. Our realtor uneasily ended this home tour abruptly. As we walked down next door, my mother-in-law mentioned how strange it was that the home we saw before only a few feet away didn't have the problem. I dismissed it that maybe the animals aren't used to the buildings, and Japanese crows are pretty annoying and have real personalities. Someone must have crossed them, right? I didn't like the home anyway. The third home felt so heavy as soon as we entered I tried to ignore it, and enjoyed the dining room just adjacent from the kitchen. It was almost perfect. I could make it work, I knew it. There was even a large backyard for our 2 dogs that the realtor even considered in his search. The living room was a bit small, but again I could make it work. No crows upstairs, confirmed by my mother and son-in-law. I took it upon myself to look out the window of the living room. I really wish I didn't. See, my parents and sister always say we inherited a gift to see things others cannot. Throughout my life, I've been through so much therapy and taken so much medication to make the sounds and visions stop. But there's no such thing. I was in a very good place at that moment in time, and I look out the window, and there's a small forest, tall trees and grass. But what was out of place was a large man, standing there staring back at me in my direction. He didn't look right. He was charred. His skin was clearly burned, and although he was a good distance, I could see the shrinking crinkle around his neck and shoulders. I couldn't move. I wanted to so badly. That's when I saw his eyes directly. Dark black centers surrounded by white, as if his eyelids were burnt off. I heard my husband calling me, asking me something about my opinion until I guessed he noticed I didn't move or stop staring. I felt him step to my side and he asked if everything was alright. All I could muster, as I kept an eye with the man, was, "Can you see him?" I didn't want to stop looking in case he moved, and everyone thought I was crazy. My husband looked but said, "The forest is nice. We need to make sure the dogs don't wander off in there and get ticks." He didn't see him, only I could. I thought I was good. I thought I got better. My husband asked me, "Do you see anything else or something?" When he grabbed my hand to get my attention, I finally looked away to our realtor. Confused, he looked at me with an awkward smile. I guess I looked too serious and asked him what happened in the area. He said he didn't know and asked me why. I told him I saw a man in the forest, and I didn't include the details. I just wanted to know if anything had happened. I watched him go through his folders and shake his head before telling me he didn't know, but since we were starting to like the home, he would check for us. It was an uneasy ride home. The burnt face of the man stuck in my head as my husband and his mother spoke about the last home's great features. A few hours later, we went to my in-laws' place for dinner, my husband asking me why I was so quiet if I liked the home so much. Sending my son to another room to play, I explained to him and his parents in detail what I saw. Maybe they all thought I was crazy, because his dad was quiet before getting up and going to another room and bringing a map. Pointing to it, he asked us if this was the area. My husband confirmed, and my father-in-law's face was stoic, and he nodded before explaining that there was a reason that area was a new development. The government just released the land because it had passed the allotted time of closure after an accident. He elaborated that when he was younger, he heard of a plane crash happened there, where several people died. The main area where it landed was still closed off, and the government owned the place, where bodies and debris were found and cleaned up, and it has slowly been released. My mother-in-law is really superstitious, probably where my husband gets it from, and says we should forget that area. A few moments after dinner, we get a phone call from our realtor, who, apologizing profusely that he didn't know any deaths had occurred in the area, confirmed what my father-in-law said was true. After his many apologies, he promised to do a better job researching his area, and asked if we had known about the area before. My husband replied saying that I am not familiar with anything in the entire city since I am not from here, so there's no way that I would have known what happened many years ago. Once all the apologizing and promises were done, my husband hung up, and his parents didn't judge me. They only said it's good to know sooner rather than later. They truly believe I have a talent as well, but even if that's true, I don't want to believe it, even if this isn't the only time this has happened. Most days from 7th grade to senior year, when I walked home from school, I'd cut through a park. It has a track around it which is just a 2-foot wide paved path, and on the other side there's a church and a funeral home with their backs to the park, and on the other side it's just woods. It was January of my sophomore year, and we'd had a warm winter, so no snow but plenty of rain. That made the little paved path so covered in puddles it was impossible not to splash, and the grass was so soggy it'd make a squelching noise when you walked on it. No matter the weather or time of day, there's always at least one person jogging or something. I was partway down the path when I heard footsteps, like a man wearing heavy boots and a dog collar jingling very close behind me. I moved to the side so they could pass me, but no one did. I turned around and there was no one behind me. No one as far as you could see in any direction, not even any cars in the church or funeral parking lots. I thought that was weird, but I kept walking. I heard them behind me again as soon as I started up, so I stopped and turned around, and the footsteps and jingling stopped. When I continued walking, so did it. This happened a few more times, and I was starting to get nervous, and the fact that the person and dog were walking and didn't splash through any puddles was weirding me out. It was ankle-deep water almost. They sounded so close too, like they were less than a foot behind me, the whole time. Oddly enough, I didn't hear the dog's footsteps, just its collar. But after maybe the 4th time, I stopped. It sounded like the person had come to a stop right behind me. Then directly behind me, I heard a deep, low, unmistakable dog growl, which sounded like it was coming from maybe 1.5 to 2 feet off the ground. Well, I didn't need to hear that twice, let me tell you, so I started running down the path, out the park, and the 1/4 mile home. I've never run so fast or run more than a few feet in my whole life, and I triple-checked that the door was locked. I later realized that I'd first heard the man and dog when I was walking past the back of the funeral home. To this day, I'm unsure if that's of any significance. I used to live in a flat in an old house, 18th century, and one-time home of a fairly famous artist. One night I woke up and there was a little boy standing at the foot of my bed, dressed smartly in what I thought at the time was a tuxedo or dinner suit. I've had sleep paralysis before, so I shut my eyes and tried to ignore the panic overcoming me. I could feel the bed depress as he climbed onto the bed and crawls up until he's right behind me. I felt him put his arms around me and then breathe into my ear, but it's what he said which freaked me the hell out. "Come and play with my friends. He's called Colourful-Iffy." Just the way he said it, and the way I knew he wasn't talking to me, and what the hell he was talking to. I slammed my head backwards, which either scared him off or woke me up properly. Remember how I said the house once belonged to an artist? I looked up some of his paintings, mostly landscapes and buildings, but one of them was a painting of a little boy in finery, which looked eerily similar to the boy I had seen in my room. I grew up in a haunted house and never really liked talking about it. The house had a bit of a messy history as well, but I'm not sure if that really ever played a part. Not the stuff I'm aware of anyway. When I grew up, my brother and I talked about it, and it turns out he'd experienced things as well, though I never went into any details of my own. The part people seem most interested in are the 3 specific things that I encountered frequently, so that's what I'm going to focus on. The first is the boy. There was a young boy of maybe 9, perhaps even a little younger, who stayed in my room. I wasn't even aware of him until I moved from my brother's room to my own. He never spoke and always seemed really scared. He hid in different places in my room, under the bed, in the closet, in corners, even once or twice in the upper corner of the room against the ceiling. Sometimes suggested he may be scared of the other 2, but I didn't know if he was even aware of the old woman, who was the only other one that came into my room. I don't know for sure, I guess. I don't know anything for sure, but to be fair, whatever the case, I recall that he had shortish but messy brown hair and wore red, white and blue striped rugby-style shirt. I believe he was aware of me. He mostly kept to himself, but he would stare at me sometimes, and would open and close my closet and this little armory in my room. But most of the time, if I didn't see him, I wouldn't even know that he was there. The old lady. She was not confined to my room, but I rarely saw her anywhere else. Like I said, she used to wake me up staring at me face to face, almost nose to nose. She had huge eyes. I remember that vividly. Whenever I would see her, she would usually be staring at me. I always had this feeling that when she was in my face at night, she was checking on me to see if I was breathing. I really don't know why I got that feeling. She was mostly not frightening, but she scared me once or twice pretty badly. Once was at night. I was maybe 10 to 11. She woke me up right in my face. The problem was I was already having a pretty bad nightmare. I pretty much only have nightmares and stress dreams, and I screamed. I don't know if that scared her or annoyed her, but she shrieked and sort of scuttled away. That was the worst one. Other times she mainly just creeps me out. She likes to hum these weird sounding songs and basically looks like an old lady. Floral print dress and stockings. The eyes were pretty creepy as well though, I suppose. Next, the bad one. This is the only one I genuinely feared. It never touched or hurt me, except when I would fall or stub a toe while fleeing. Sometimes it felt like a woman, but other times it didn't feel like a specific gender. It liked to chase me, especially up the stairs. When it did that, it was a woman with very stringy and greasy hair, and it either didn't have a jaw or its jaw was unhinged, with something disgusting slobbering from the mouth. Its tongue hung from its mouth almost to the floor, and it was wearing something very bulky. The best I can describe it is that it seemed to be wearing a guile suit. It had fringes and was dark, seemed dirty as well. I'm not even sure if it was clothing or being worn. The strangest part of this one is that I never saw it like I did the others. I just sort of felt it, and always had a vivid mental image. It didn't always look like a woman thing. Sometimes I didn't get an image, only a feeling. She used to scream as I turned the hall corner too, just to jump scare me, it seemed. It was a real a-hole, even though it never touched me. I always got the feeling that it hated me, like if it had the ability to, it would have hurt me. I would talk about it more, but as a grown man, I've got knots in my tummy just thinking about it. I often doubt if I even believe my own experiences. I have been plagued with nightmares for so long, but I never rule out dreams. But it doesn't cover all of it. I'm a very logical person and always play the skeptic when I discuss the paranormal with friends. I think this is part of the reason I don't share this stuff often. Maybe only with 3 other people and never in so much detail. So, believe what you want. I may not even believe in it sometimes, and still want to tell myself that it's all just a dream. When I was 18, I moved into a first-floor apartment with my best friend. The house is the last one on the street, and it borders woods to the left side of it, and a very large cemetery in the back. Literally, the backyard was separated by a foot-high rock wall that instantly turns into the tombstone area. Neither of us thought much of it when we moved in because we were 18 and didn't believe in ghosts. So the first month it started to feel strange. I don't know how to describe it, but I hated being there alone, and I was never that way before. I always felt that need to turn around and see if something was following me. Then, strange things would happen. Tiny things turned up missing, and would reappear in odd places. I once walked into my bedroom and found a pair of sunglasses centered on the floor of the room, and my dog, this little chihuahua, and started barking and growling at nothing, maybe at a wall or something. It sounds like nothing, but he never acted that way before. It would scare the life out of me. I spoke to my friend, and turns out it's the same thing for her. It continues on like this for a while, until one day my friend calls me late at night, and said that she'd been laying in bed trying to fall asleep, when she started to think about a deceased family member, and her vanity mirror light turned on, which had never ever happened before. It just popped on. So, main creepy thing that happened to me. I was eating dinner one night in the kitchen area, which faced away from the living room and front door. I was watching Netflix on my iPad, when out of nowhere, I felt ridiculously out of control, like my entire world had shifted. It was like this hysterical panic. After a few moments, my dog, who was in the kitchen with me, starts barking and growling at the front door area. He's going absolutely insane, and I'm still freaking out. I started bawling and calling my friend, asking her to come home. I then shut the door between the kitchen area and the living room, with my dog in the kitchen with me. I'm not more than a minute into the phone call when I hear a huge crash in the living room. I never left the kitchen area, and I continued to just cry on the phone until my friend and her boyfriend at the time got home. This didn't really change when they arrived. I was still extremely upset. After a bit, my friend tells me that the lamp, which had been on the shelf by the front door, had been smashed into the middle of the room. The lamp was a hefty, Tiffany-style lamp that weighed a good amount and had been plugged into the wall. When I went out and looked, the lamp had moved at least 3 feet away and was smashed, as she stated, in the middle of the room. The next day, my mum brought over some sage, and we just burnt it along the walls and rooms. Per Google, my friend and I kind of talked out loud to the ghosts. We assumed they were from the cemetery. We had emailed our landlord explaining the circumstances and told him we would be moving out. But immediately after that incident, things got better. It's so difficult to explain. I didn't feel alone per se, but I didn't feel any panic either. I didn't have that weird dread from before. We had a few incidents after that, which I won't go into. None of it made us feel unsafe. It just was acknowledgement that there was 100% something paranormal going on. We lived there for 4.5 years, and I still miss that place. But when I tell my friend about it now, I can never fully explain that feeling that came over me that night. How abrupt and terrifying it was. I'm not an emotional person, and nothing will ever come close to that again. When I was younger, I used to live in a condo. I had my own room while my parents' room was across from mine. Think of a T-shape with a room on either end of the top line. It would be relatively easy to see and hear someone in the other room. Now it was nighttime and I was asleep, but I woke up at what I assume was around midnight, or maybe a few hours past. Not exactly sure. Now as a kid I was never afraid of the dark per se, but wasn't too fond of it either. The thought of not being able to see what could be lurking close by, and being that vulnerable, always kind of freaked me out a bit. But I never believed in monsters in the closet or under the bed or anything like that. But I always just got creeped out by that dark, something of which I've now grown out of mostly. And of course, being the kid I was, waking up that late at night when it was that dark out, I hid under the safety of my blankets. And that's when it happened. I was lying on my side, still under the sheets, and I felt something poke me. It felt like someone just poked my side. That's it. Nothing else, just that. Now I was a kid and it was late, but it was a very significant and noticeable feeling. Of course, immediately I threw off my sheets the second I felt that, and to my surprise, no one was there. I thought it might be one of my parents who sometimes got up late at night checking on me to see if I was asleep, as a kid I liked staying up. I grabbed a late night snack from the fridge, ate that and went back to my room, pulling the covers over my head once more, and I even remember asking my parents the next day if they had come into my room, and they both said no. At the time that this story occurred, my mum and her boyfriend had just broken up. She decided to move back to our hometown, as in me, my sister, and brother's hometown, as it was closer to where she worked. Temporarily, we had gotten an apartment, and it's like one of those apartments that are above stores. There was only 2 apartments upstairs in our section, and as soon as we got into the place for the first time, it was unsettling. Just the overall feel of the place was a bit off, but me being 8, I thought I was perhaps homesick, missing my old abode. This apartment had holes in the walls, almost as if the previous people living there had cameras. At least that's what my mother speculated. The first time someone in the family experienced anything unusual, it was actually my mother. She had woken up to her bedroom door opening and shutting. Assuming it was one of us, she got up and opened her door. Shocked when she saw no one, she went into the living room, where me and my sister were sleeping on the couch, because our beds hadn't been set up yet, and although it spooked her, she just ignored it and went back to bed. But then she laid down. The other half of her bed was freezing. She said it felt like a fan was blowing only on that half, but there was no fan nor ceiling ventilation. The second experience was when my brother had just brought his baby home from the hospital, and in the beginning all was good, until the baby, Eli, was about 2 weeks old. My brother had actually switched rooms with me and my sister, so he had the room for the baby stuff. But every single time my brother would go into the room, Eli would just cry, and wouldn't stop until they left the room. This next experience was by far the second worst. The worst is still yet to come. One day my sister and I were both sick, so we did not go to school. I just woke up from my nap, when I heard kids running up and down the stairs laughing. It was loud enough to wake my sister up also. There were only 2 apartments upstairs, and I don't think anyone lived in the other. Which, I see why. The laughing would randomly happen for weeks. It turned into patty cake, coming from the closet of the room that my nephew would refuse to go into. And now the worst, which still gives me goosebumps to this day. It was wintertime. Me and my sister had a movie night the previous night because school was cancelled due to snow. When I awoke, I turned on my side so that I was facing the TV. I opened my eyes and immediately laid my eyes on a little girl. I'd never seen her before, and she was just standing there. I was paralyzed in fear. I couldn't move, not even my eyes. She stood there staring at my sister as she slept, and suddenly, after 2 of the longest minutes of my life, my sister shot up quickly and did the same. She started crying and telling me about the nightmare she had, and that it felt like someone was watching her the whole time. Me being young and scared, I started to cry too, as I told her about the little girl. My mum was at work, and my brother was at his girlfriend's house, so I called my grandma to come and pick us up. The rest of the day was normal. After this, small things kept happening for the other month we lived there. 9 years later, my sister, who's 22, sees this little girl, but I don't. I may hear a giggle, but I don't see her anymore. My sister says sometimes she'll just poke her head around our TV stand and then vanish. That's all. I've always been a bit odd. I remember seeing colour shadows of people since I was 5. I've had premonition dreams that come to pass. When I was in my late 20s, I was aligned with those that shared similar experiences. I delved deeper into my native Alaskan beliefs, yearning for more understanding. So a few years ago, an acquaintance/co-worker asked for help at her apartment, smudging as she felt a presence. I agreed, as I'd conducted a few in the past. I arrived at an hour to midnight and was met by my co-worker and another co-worker. The rest of the occupants were not at the residency. The apartment was quaint. The entryway, living area, kitchen, small bath, and 2 bedrooms. I began doing my thing, burning sage and chanting. I made my way through the rooms, and as I did, I kept hearing the name Lucy. I dismissed it temporarily. Once I finished blessing the apartment, my co-worker and I sat in the living room area. I had this nagging feeling to ask who Lucy is. Mind you, this living area was a TV stand, 2 sofas, and a large square-foot rest, and a small door to a closet in one corner. So I ask, does the name Lucy mean anything to you? Can you tell me who Lucy was? The co-worker that lived in the apartment went behind the smaller sofa, and I hadn't noticed there was a walking space behind it. It was at an angle in the front of a window, and she reached down behind the sofa and returned to the square-foot rest in front of me, and placed a pink gecko on the footstool, explaining, "This is Lucy." I was shocked, as I hadn't experienced an animal telling me its name before. I'd never met a lizard up until that point. The 3 of us were a bit awestruck, as I had no knowledge of her pet lizard. Lucy was quite happy to scurry all over me, climb up my neck, and remained nestled in my hair until I left. It was a beautiful moment that has me wonder if other people have had similar things happen to them. I live in Ottawa, Ontario, and work for myself as a residential HVAC installer. One winter in the late 2000s, I had a job in the downtown area, reconfiguring some ductwork in a very large 3-story house that was undergoing a full renovation. I estimate the job to be about a day's work and schedule accordingly. The day of that job, however, I overslept and showed up late in the morning. The contractor who hired me greeted me with a sarcastic "good afternoon" in reference to my late arrival. The house had pretty much been gutted down to the studs, and there were several tradesmen working in various parts of the house. My work was on the second floor, so I made a few trips to bring all my tools from the van and got to work. As is often the case, the work turned out to be more involved than I had expected, so I knew I had to work fast or I was going to be there all night. I became very focused on my work, and after a while noticed the lights go out, as one of the work crews, maybe the plumbers, were leaving. They said something about there only being one extension cord I could use for power, as there were no outlets anywhere. I absent-mindedly thanked them but stayed focused on the work, relying on the natural light spilling in through the windows. At some point later on I noticed the natural light was getting dim, so I started thinking I would need to get out my trouble light soon. A little while after that I noticed it seemed to be a little quiet, so I stopped working and looked around. I couldn't see anyone or hear any voices, but I had the distinct feeling that there was still someone around. The time had come to plug in my trouble light, so I went over to where the extension cord was and plugged in. Then I listened for noises downstairs but heard nothing. I checked the time on my phone and it was after 5 p.m. I walked up to a window at the front of the house and looked down at the big laneway, which seemed very far down from this towering house. Aside from my van, it was empty. Being wintertime, it was now pretty much dark out. It was one of those dreary, cloudy winter evenings. Wind was blowing a light dusting of snow in the front of the streetlights. There wasn't anyone to be seen on the street. In that moment of realization that I was alone in the house, that feeling I had of someone being around instantly intensified into a very strong feeling that someone was definitely on the second floor, watching me through the bare studded walls. The hair stood up on the back of my neck and arms, and I turned around and saw no one. I had one trouble light lighting the floor with all my tools spread all over the place. I had about an hour and a half left of work to do, and I often work by myself in empty houses, and in the evenings, and I'm a large guy that doesn't scare easily. The bottom line was, despite that feeling of being watched, I had to put on my big boy pants, so to speak, to get the job done. I've never put ductwork together faster in my life. I just tried to block out my emotions and work. As I worked, and as the night got darker around me, that presence intensified. It definitely felt malevolent, and after a while it seemed to be coming from every direction, especially the stairs leading to the third floor. It seemed quite angry that I was here. I was afraid to focus my attention on anything around me for fear of actually seeing or hearing something to go with that presence. To have to finish my work and clean up my tools under that angry, oppressive presence was horrible. By the time I packed up, then started bringing my tools downstairs, it almost felt like it was chasing me out of the house. The last thing I had to do, and the hardest, was to make that last trip back up to get my final load of tools. Before I pulled out of the parking lot, I looked up at the house and it seemed to be glaring at me. I've had paranormal encounters before, and I couldn't discern whether this was just demonic in nature or a very angry ghost. I remember thinking as I drove away, God help whomever was moving into that house, and in future, I should try to avoid sleeping late. About 6 years ago, I was living by myself in Queensland, Australia, in this house that was built in the 50s. It had one of those oven/stove tops with the main on-off switch on the wall next to it, and an unused barbecue on the front porch. Quite often I would be coming home or leaving the house and would notice that the knobs on the barbecue would be turned all the way around to fully heat, but not attached to gas meant that there were no flames. I thought it was strange, but never paid it much mind. Then, I started noticing that the knobs on the oven and stove kept moving to full heat several times a day. This was also when they were turned off, so again I wasn't in any danger. I always remembered to turn it off when I finished using it, as I'm very paranoid about fire safety, living in Australia. After 6 months of this, my boyfriend Alex at the time ended up moving in with me, and he began noticing the oven knobs moving. I told him about the barbecue doing it for months on end, and half-jokingly said to him there must be a ghost living with us. Alex outright refused to even entertain the notion of this, so teasingly I went along with the ghost theory for a few months, like I wholeheartedly believed it, and would talk to the ghost when he was around, saying things like, "Well, I don't mind you staying with us, sorry about him. You're more than welcome to live here if you abide by the housemate agreement. You're one of the best housemates I've ever had." Alex would always get so mad at me for doing this, but I couldn't help by poking fun like that, especially when the knobs were continuing to be turned on seemingly on their own accord. Eventually, we broke up, but not because of the ghost talking. I offered for him to stay in the guest bedroom on the other side of the house until he found a new place, or the lease ran out in 3 months' time, which he accepted. We still hung out as mates, same friend circles and living together and all, and I wasn't that upset about it, to be honest. About a month later it was Halloween. I was in my bedroom, struggling to zip up my dress, and wasn't at all keen on going out anyway, and just generally not in a good mood. Alex burst into my room, telling me to hurry up as he came in. The moment he stepped into my room, I told him to piss off. As I said that, my solid steel jewelry stand that looks like a mini coat rack went flying off the dresser that sits next to the door, straight at him, and snapped clean in half, along with my pencil tin, which, for lack of a better description, exploded pencils at him. He freaked right out and left immediately. I thanked the ghost just in case. Does anyone have any similar experiences or thoughts on what could have caused these occurrences? Not sure if related, but I found a naked Barbie doll bound to my fence around the time I started to notice the barbecue, staring at my front door. Its fingers had been melted together and had black scorch marks all over its body, like that sooty black stuff that you see when things have been near a flame, whose hair had been colored pink and green the same as mine. Creeped me right out. However, that could have easily just been some loony in the neighborhood. I'm a registered nurse and a medical student, so I tend to gear towards a rational and scientific explanation to everything. Despite that, during my nursing career, I've had some truly mind-blowing experiences happen to me when patients have passed or when patients were in altered mental states. To be specific, I felt patients pass prior to their passing. I saw their souls leave, or in some cases linger after the passing. I've had patients describe other patients who've just passed as standing behind me, full physical detail, having never met or seen said patient. One night I was working on the surgical floor, which used to be Peds ward, and all of a sudden a very sober-minded patient says he sees a little girl banging on the window asking to let her out because it's too cold on the other side. It still gives me shivers to this day. One day when I was around 5 or 6 years old, I saw a picture of a girl at my grandpa's house and asked him why is this girl not coming to play with me anymore. I assumed her to be a family friend's daughter. He turned pale as a ghost and said that I must be confused, and explained to me that this was my late sister, whom I never got to meet as she passed before I was born. When I was 17 to 18 years old, my family rented this beautiful apartment for about 2 to 3 years. I always saw things there, and had this feeling of dread, anxiety, and sadness. One night I went to bed and the lamp on my night table turned on by itself and fell next to me. Long story short, after we moved out, my parents told me that there had been one passing due to suicide, a hanging in my room. and one death due to overdose in the bathroom. I always told my parents there was something wrong with that place, but they just denied it until we finally moved, and I was able to predict tragedy in our family, even though I didn't know whom it would happen to. I mean, a few months before my grandpa's passing, I said I'm worried about him, only that I was worried about the wrong grandpa, as I had two at the time. Same thing happened with my grandma a few years later. Like I knew something bad was about to happen, some random stuff I was about to predict, like a birth of my daughter a year before I got pregnant with her, my friends having babies before it even happened, and work-related stuff like transfers or cuts, but that's all minor. Now, 2 weeks ago, my significant other passed away in his sleep due to a heart attack at the age of 35. To say that I felt like my heart was ripped from my chest is to say nothing. One day we were planning our wedding, and the next day I was preparing his funeral. And this is what gets me. I got no signs or premonitions that this was coming. The only thing I can say is that I was experiencing my own heart having palpitations and episodes when I felt like it skipped a beat. Had it been about a year. But I wonder if I'm just attributing this as something related. After his passing, I was going mental, praying, which I never do, and talking to myself, begging him to send me a sign, any sign that he's okay. But I had nothing. No dreams or anything. Then one day, I'm having a breakdown while picking up my teenage sister from her school, and she breaks it to me that she woke up one night at 3 a.m. after having a dream about V. He appeared to her in his favorite basketball shorts. She didn't know those were his favorites, but I did, and there was nothing around him. But he smiled and said, "I am okay," the exact words I used, and he disappeared, and then she awoke. I have to note that nothing ever affects my sister. She is in her own world, and you can have a nuke drop next to her and she wouldn't flinch in her sleep. She said she felt very energetic after her dream and didn't go back to sleep. I had his Breitling watch, and when I went to retrieve it, I noted that, because it wasn't moved in a while, that the time stopped at 3 a.m. sharp. Perhaps this was a coincidence, but if you add up the amount of minutes and seconds and hours that a watch has to click through, it's incredibly unlikely. Thereafter, many weird, strange things happened. Like YouTube kept coming up with suggestions of songs with ghosts in their name. Much more stuff happened, but I attributed it to going mental and seeking out the signs. A few days ago, me and my sister were in the kitchen. My daughter was just upstairs but very close to us, with no one else in the house. Me and my sister are talking about my significant other, when all of a sudden we both hear my daughter call my name. I go to check on her and she's genuinely confused. She's 8, playing on her iPad, and she never called my name. I got so mad at her, thinking she was just joking with me, but her confusion and fear were genuine. My sister and I both heard it, and were very shaken by it. To clarify, the voice was unmistakably that of my daughter. Yesterday I was on our Reddit Paranormal, and out of the blue, the text on the page started to shake. I don't know how else to describe it. Right after I came across the post of a medium who was replying to another Redditor, but it felt like that message was for me. I read the original post and my mind was blown. So many details down to the initial of her friend passing away. It was identical. I replied on the post, and that seemed to be too much of a coincidence. I want to believe that my significant other is trying to communicate with me, and I want to believe that he can see or hear me, but it frustrates me I'm not getting anything tangible from him, anything like a dream or a vision, something that I couldn't just explain away. I'm confused as to why I can't pick up as much from him as I could with others. At the same time, I feel like he's just trying to relay a message to me. Perhaps I'm going mental with grief while holding onto any thread, but your insight in this situation is truly appreciated. My whole life, my mother has told me snippets from her childhood. From what I've learned from her, my father, and eavesdropping on family conversations, my mother had a terrible childhood. My grandfather was an abusive junkie who left her home alone for days at a time. It wasn't until she was 17 she was able to escape. In her mid-20s, she met my father and they got married. They tried for years to have children, but had been told they would never be able to. Then on March 26, 2001, my grandmother had an overdose in what is now my parents' bedroom. We don't know if it was accidental or purposeful, but they believe it was an accident. The next day, the 27th, was the date put on her death certificate. Exactly 1 year later, my parents had their first child, me. Growing up, I didn't know anything about my grandmother besides her name. That is until one day I was in the 4th grade, going through our home library. I come across a book and am instantly drawn to it. The book is a law book. I liked books so much that I took it to school the next day to read. That is when I decided I wanted to become a lawyer, and I plan on starting college next year to pursue that dream. The reason I'm telling you this is because I would find out later that the book had belonged to my grandmother, and at one point in time she herself had been in law school but never graduated. There's always been small coincidences such as these that have made me feel connected to her, as if she was still here now. This is where things begin to get weird. For as long as I can remember, I hear things at night in the attic and walls. The obvious answer would be animals, but I've heard animal sounds in the attic before. Scratching, scampering, squeaking, but that's not what I hear. It's thuds, heavy things being moved about. High heels was very common when I was younger. My sister and I have bedrooms on one side of the house and my parents on the other. For years, my sister and I have been complaining about these noises, but my parents have never been able to find anything or hear anything themselves. Everything I've told you so far is interesting, but I didn't consider it enough to share. But things have been getting weirder lately, and I've become genuinely concerned. Personally, I've always believed in spirits, and that there may be one in this house, but I never had anything besides noises and feelings to back it up. That is until a few weeks ago. I was having a bad day. So bad, in fact, I was sitting on my bed sobbing. This may seem dramatic, but I felt the need to open my arms wide and release my emotions. And that was the first time it happened. I heard something, and I looked up. The cords on my fan were swinging back and forth rapidly. My fan wasn't on, and my arms weren't long enough to reach the cords. I even tried to stretch and touch them from where I was sitting, but I was at least 2 to 3 feet away from even being close. Now to the reason I'm sharing this. About half hour ago, I'm sitting on my bed watching a show when I heard a noise. I look up, and only one of the cords was moving, and fast. My fan wasn't on. I put my hands around the cords to feel if maybe air had done that, although it doesn't explain how only one would be moving without the others being affected. I'm honestly very freaked out, and would appreciate any thoughts and suggestions. I know that a lot of people tend to dismiss them as dreams, hallucinations, or wishful thinking, and I can understand people's reasoning to think that. But no one can convince me that they aren't real. For my life, I've both seen and interacted with the spirits of the dearly departed. I've had many pets over my 38 years of life. Cats, dogs, goldfish, blue-tongued lizards, and even cicadas. This happened in the year of 1985, when I was 4 years old. My family, which consisted of my mother, father, and sister who was a year older than me, lived in a modest-sized home that had a rectangular-sized backyard, with a mandarin tree and row of bushes growing along the back fence. At the time, we had this white male cat called Fluffy. He was beautiful. During the summer, he loved to wander down to the end of the backyard, where the mandarin tree stood, and sleep in the shade it provided. Without fail, he could always be found sleeping under that tree, and we never worried about not seeing him for hours on end, and only had to call him each night in for his dinner, where a blur of white fluff would race across the yard between the feet of whomever had called him, and straight into the house to polish off the food in his bowl. One day, a few days before I turned 5, I'd come back home after spending a few weeks visiting a foster father and foster sister down in Yass, a country town near the Australian capital of Canberra. I was so excited to reunite with Fluffy that I practically jumped out the car the instant we parked in the driveway and raced around the side of the house and straight into the backyard, tearing along the lawn on a mission to see my little friend. When I got to the mandarin tree, I stopped short. Fluffy wasn't there. I noticed that the ground around the tree where he slept had been disturbed, as though someone had dug a hole and then decided to fill it in. But to my 5-year-old mind, I didn't think too much about this. I paced up and down the length of the back fence, calling Fluffy's name, but nothing. He never appeared. I looked back down the yard towards the house, where Mum was slowly making her way towards me, a sad expression on her face. She told me that week previously, Fluffy had been hit by a van and was killed. She and my sister decided to bury him in his favorite spot beneath the mandarin tree, where he seemed happiest most. This made me realize that what the disturbed mound of soil was that I had seen. I cried for days afterwards, knowing that I'd lost my best friend and how I'd never see him again. About a week later, I was sitting in the backyard playing with my Voltron lion toys that my parents had brought me in an attempt to cheer me up, when I heard a meow coming from the bottom of the yard in the direction of the mandarin tree. I didn't take any notice, thinking it was one of many neighborhood cats, and kept on playing with the tiny pink Princess Allura that came as an accessory to the blue lion. This time I looked up in the direction of where I thought the meow had come from, and saw a ball of white fur about 3 feet between the tree and myself, standing on the lawn, looking at me. The cat looked like Fluffy. I thought I was seeing things, that I had to do a double take, and it was him standing there in front of me. I cast my toys aside and called out, "Fluffy?" The cat let out a soft meow in reply, before turning and walking over to the tree. I clumsily got to my feet to follow, but when I got to the tree, he was nowhere to be seen. I looked behind the tree, between the gap of the back fence and the base of the tree, but he wasn't there. I then checked the bush that lined the back fence. Nothing. It was like he had disappeared. I thought maybe he had jumped over the fence and into the neighbor's backyard, when I heard the meow once again, this time directly behind me. I spun around and there he was, standing on that patch of disturbed soil from which my mother and sister had allegedly buried him. I opened my arms, ready to embrace him with the biggest hug, when he meowed again and faded on the spot. I didn't wait. I raced towards the house, tripping over my discarded toys to tell my mum that I had seen Fluffy. Naturally, she didn't believe me. We lived in that house for another year before moving, and I've never been back there since. I know that Fluffy came back to tell me that day goodbye, that everything was alright. I just hoped the new owners of the house never cut down that tree, so my best friend will always be able to enjoy his favorite sleeping spot. My home is next to a friend's, who I grew up with. His parents live across the road from him, a caddy corner to me. There's a field in between my friend's house and mine. I'm telling you all of this because location and home placement become relevant soon. So my neighbor's oldest daughter started messing with a Ouija board. I don't know if that is what started all this, as we had incidents in the past, but all of this particular phenomenon that I'm talking about here happened after. I tried to tell her that she didn't need to mess with it, and that she didn't understand the extent of things she was attempting to contact. But she's 14, and did not listen. I know people play with them, but I personally believe that they can let things in that you don't want. A few weeks after this, my neighbor's stepson saw a light shining in his bedroom window. He went outside to investigate, and found nothing. The light began to make appearance in all 3 of the houses I mentioned, my neighbor's, his parents across the road, and mine. My mum, I'm grown but have to live with her because of a seizure disorder that I have and can't control, says one night, "I see a light." She said it looked like a flashlight through her window, but shining on the ceiling. I went out to investigate, quite pissed off because I thought someone was messing with my mum. I couldn't find anyone, so I called the cops. Keep in mind at this point, it has been going on for a week to all 3 houses. The deputy shows up and takes me around with him, investigating, then makes a very interesting point. There was dew on the grass even though it was night, and my footprints were the only ones visible. Interesting and strange, I thought. Well, my neighbor's mum started seeing this light every night in her bedroom. She sleeps on one end of the house and her husband on the other, because he has to get up early for work. So every time she looks out the window, there's nothing to be seen. She also starts to see what looks similar to laser pointers doing the same. It shines through the window onto the ceiling, and it apparently was not exactly like a laser pointer but quite similar. Now here's where things start to get strange. My neighbor was in his garage and saw the laser pointer on the wall. This was at night, and he was out in his garage smoking a cigarette. He steps outside and sees nothing, walks back into his garage, and it's on the back of his wall. Then, he said that it spread out and morphed into a strange, ancient-looking religious image, like something out of an ancient Eastern religion. He said it maybe looked Buddhist. He can't really describe it any better than that. So fast forward a few days, his mum had still been seeing the lights and the laser-like image continually. So he messages me and asks to sit with him in the shadows outside of his house and watch his mum's house. Her bedroom is facing his yard. We sat up there for about an hour or so, and we were actively watching her house for anything whatsoever, lights, movement, the like. We see nothing, and she texts him saying that all the lights are shining in her window, when we saw nothing at all. So we take off to her backyard, and walk behind her shed where the lawnmowers are to get a better look. And on the way to the shed, he spins around and says, "Man, do you smell that? It smelled like something was burning, like burning leaves mixed with sulfur." We looked around the shed towards the main part of the yard and lawn, and a street light at the house right next door to them, so we had a good view of her lawn from this angle. We sat there, and there was a haze and fog on her yard only. We thought that maybe someone had been burning something, but thought it was strange since it was only on her yard. We spoke about this for literally about 10 seconds behind this shed, and he says, "Hey, the smell is gone." I realized that he was right, and we looked around the corner of the shed and the fog was completely gone. This would not have gone in 10 seconds. Well, about a week later, his mum is getting fed up with the nightly light show, and instead of looking out her bedroom window like usual and finding nothing, she starts looking out other windows. She gets to her living room and notices that at my house, keep in mind, I'm caddy corner across the road from her, that there's a fog behind my house. She said it was in the woods behind my house, and there are woods like 30 feet or so behind it, and extended just into the yard. She said it was dimly backlit as well, not brightly, but noticeably. Here's where things get strange. She says that at this point, 5 or 6 strange translucent figures come out the fog into my yard, right outside my bedroom, and into the field between mine and my neighbor's house. She said they were very human-shaped, roughly, but strange-looking, and didn't give many details about their features because she couldn't see the features very well from where she was. They looked almost like a hologram. I'm not sure what she meant by that. She couldn't fully describe their appearance, just that they came out of the haze and into the field and then glided over the ground without stepping. She said they kept getting in a group and bending over and squatting down and doing something like that. She didn't know what they were doing, but it made her think of digging. So they glide across the field, across the road and through her yard, past our house, towards the barn, into the woods. She said that every time she saw them pass by her house, the lights would happen on her ceiling in her room. She said that made this strange journey back and forth a total of 5 times that night, one time after another. That's basically it. I don't know what to make of it. I hope maybe some of you can shed some light on this inexplicable phenomenon. Some members of my family built a house in the country back in the early 90s. Strangely, there had historically been houses previously there which had burned down. I don't know if anyone passed in either, but I have my suspicions. As they were building the house, a neighbor approached and plainly told them that their house was going to burn down. It was the first thing anyone ever said to them about their house. The house still does exist and they still live there, but there have always been some weird happenings in the house. The mother was studying for a college test and heard a ball bouncing against the wall in one of the children's rooms. She called for the child to stop throwing the ball, forgetting that they were at school. As she did so, the ball rolled down the bedroom hallway towards the living room and into her line of sight. She was alone in the house. The boy and I were once in his basement room, and we saw the face of something human-like, but completely dull and lifeless in the storm window, the little 18-inch tall window at the ceiling in some basement rooms. There's no way the face could have been there because the storm window is only 18 inches deep and the face was oriented normally. Sleeping in this house is like a real nightmare. As a child, I would feel things brushing my arms and legs when I slept. There was this awful Mrs. Beasley doll that the mother had, that I swear would follow you with its head as you walked around. My grandfather and I shared close birthdays 2 days apart, and we both loved chocolate cake. My mum learned her mum's recipe, which was passed down from her mum, so I suppose I inherited this love for this chocolate cake. Every year we would drive upstate to see my grandfather on his birthday, with a freshly baked cake, and he would greet us at the door with a smile, take the cake off our hands, then disappear into the kitchen. He loved this cake. He also smoked a particular type of pipe tobacco, which you could always smell in his house. To this day, whenever I catch a whiff of pipe tobacco, I think of him. He passed away in 2004, the next year for my birthday, 2 days before his. My mum was making a cake for me when she suddenly smells his pipe tobacco. Now he had lived hours away from us and hadn't been to our house in years due to my grandmother's failing health, making her unable to travel. So there's no chance of his scent lingering around. My mum realized what was happening and just laughed, saying, "Dad, don't worry. I'll set a piece of cake aside for you when it's done, but you have to be patient." And the smell went away. Now, was it my grandfather's ghost visiting my mum? Or was it my mum associating her father with the cake? I don't know. but I know I'd come back from heaven for a slice of that cake. This is an experience I had on a sleepover with 3 other girls of my sophomore year of high school. It was my friend Tina's birthday. I wasn't that close to her, but she was friends with my best friend Hannah, so we all knew each other. I had never been to her house before. I really didn't want to go to this girl's birthday party, but Hannah wanted me to go with her. Hannah also knew one of Tina's friends, Audrey, who was going to the party as well. The girl Pam was there, but none of us really knew her. So far, this had been a normal sleepover, despite Tina being a little off as usual. This wasn't weird though, since she's always an odd, compulsive liar type girl. We were all watching Hercules. Her parents had gone to bed, and they had put out a fold couch in the living room, and down the hall there were 2 queen-sized beds in a guest room for all of us to share. Tina's room and her parents were on the opposite end of the house. Tina decided she didn't want to sleep with us anymore, so she went to her own room. Pam went to the guest room to text her boyfriend and go to bed. Audrey, Hannah and I laid on the fold couch together to talk. We had our backs to the hallway, and we were facing the sliding glass door into the backyard. We kind of started to see things move outside, and we started getting creeped out. We talked about going to the guest room, but we didn't want to bother Pam. We got this sickening feeling that we were being watched from the hallway. When we looked, nothing was in the hallway, but in the picture frames we could see the shadow of a man walking back and forth down the hallway. I decided I should check on Pam. I got off the couch and ran down the hallway to see she was asleep. When I turned around to tell Hannah and Audrey, a chill ran through my body and I fell down. Hannah screamed and told me not to move. They both ran over to me, and we went into the guest room and slammed the door. Audrey and Hannah got on the daybed against the wall, and I got into bed with Pat, who woke up asking what was going on. I was having a full-on freak-out inside, not knowing what to think of anything that had just happened. The beds we were on had been pushed together. The closet was open and full of empty hangers, and I could hear the hangers moving, but I refused to look away from my feet, paralyzed in fear. All of a sudden, a giant, glowing white mass grabbed Hannah's palm and I by our feet and tried to pull us off the bed. Pam and I jumped over to Hannah and Audrey's bed. Then, the bed Pam and I were on flew to the other side of the room. I tried to rationalize it, saying it was a cat or something, but Tina didn't have any pets, so we all sat against the back of the daybed, scared. Pam had goosebumps all over her body. I couldn't even bring myself to speak. Audrey was trying to ignore it, and Hannah was trying to control the situation. Then the bed started bouncing. It felt like something was pushing us from under the bed. It was a violent bounce too. Then it stopped and Hannah started looking behind me. When she pushed me forward, then screamed. We all asked what happened. Then she said she saw something reach for me, push me, then it scratched her. She lifted up the back of her shirt to show 3 long scratches down her entire back. The bed bouncing continued, lights flickered, and things in the closet began moving. At 3 we decided to sit out in the living room, grab our courage and ran out the room onto the couch. We all saw the figure of a man still walking in the hallway, and called up our families to pick us up as soon as possible. No one answered, so we left messages. So we creeped out the house and went into the backyard and sat on the trampoline waiting until someone woke us up or we got picked up. When we saw the security bar fall and the door locked, we got up and tried to open it, but not only was the bar down, but the lock had been locked on the door. So we waited. Her mum woke up and got us and didn't ask us why we were outside or how the door was locked or anything. We all left as soon as we could, but before Hannah and I tried to figure out why everything happened, but we couldn't debunk anything. I never went back to Tina's house, ever, after that night. This all started when I was living in military housing. I was between 11 to 13. My brother and I slept in the same room because I was scared to sleep by myself at the time. I would sleep on a futon by the door, and he would sleep on his bed in the back corner. During the time living there, he would tell me that when he went to sleep, he would wake up, not being able to move, and would see a shadow figure just standing there or moving around watching him. But I didn't think it was anything, because he has sleep paralysis every now and then. One night I was sleeping over at a friend's house, and when I came back the next day, we were in a Skype call playing Team Fortress 2. He told me that night, when I was sleeping over at a friend's, he heard my mum, dad, and myself call him when he was showering. Still, I didn't put too much thought into it. After a while, my father's friend wanted to take care of his 2 dogs for a month, as he was going on a vacation. During that time it was summer, so my whole family's sleep schedule was ruined one night by my brother, father and mother, as they were walking the dogs around the block. And I was in my brother's room playing BO2 Zombies, when suddenly the door started to open slowly. It's like those paranormal videos online when they slowly open. I thought it was the wind at first, so I closed the door and locked it. When I went back to the game, it opened again and unlocked. I was freaked out at this point and closed the door and made sure to hear it click to guarantee myself it had indeed been closed all the way. I locked it and gave it a pull. It didn't open. So again, I decided to sit down and resume playing. And when I look back, I think whatever it was probably angry. And not long after, the door burst open like someone had kicked it open, and I just felt like there was a demon or a monster coming to kill me. So I ran downstairs out of the house to the neighbors in the middle of the night, ringing their doorbell, but no one answered. And I started crying in the middle of the street until my family returned from their walk. My mother got tired of us talking about this thing and called my grandma, who's very religious and spoke in a completely different language that no one understands while deep in prayer, and she goes to other people's homes to cleanse them. My mum told her everything, so my grandma went on a 20-day fast with only water, and when she was ready, which was when we were back in school, she told them to take us to school and come back, and to call her. I honestly didn't know that she knew much, but when they were on the phone, she said to go to the kid's closet and that it's in there. So my mom opened it and started to pray out loud with my grandma on speaker, telling it to go away. Then she says it went downstairs to the kitchen corner, and she tells my mom to open the door and let it out. She does just that, and it's gone. And we haven't had an experience like that again. Years later, I asked her about it, and she told me the whole story. And it was actually there much earlier than I thought. I don't even remember, but my brother and I would say, we don't like eating at the kitchen table because there's a guy in the corner staring at us. And just before everything, there was a whole flock of crows flying above our house in circles. That day that she opened the door and let it out, she could hear a squeal like an animal or a pig, and again the crows were back, but this time they were flying away. My grandma said it was the spirit of death wanting to take one of us and to destroy the family. So crazy to me. Also, throughout that whole time, my dad got cancer. My mom was suicidal and had a knife on her throat in front of us, and they were going to get divorced. My dad was discharged for the Navy for sleepwalking and taking something from a store at the barracks. Eventually, everything got better. Now I'm a junior in high school and so grateful to my grandma for helping out. When you spend your whole life seeing ghosts, there's not much that phases you. I've had many cats over the years, some passing of old age, a few who have run away, never to be seen again, and some who had the brilliant idea to pick fights with cars, which never worked in their favor. and one or two who were poisoned by neighbors, either maliciously or by accident. I will never know. I used to get visits from my great-grandma when I was 3, and since the passing of my nan and pop back in 2006 and 2010 respectively, I've seen them out of the corner of my eye, standing in various rooms of my house. My mum had been in and out of hospital from August 2014 until she herself passed in February of 2015 due to heart complications that she had all her life. And since her passing, I've seen her numerous times as well. I'm not scared whenever I see them, because I like to think that they're popping in quickly to check up on me, see that everything is going well, and then leave contented. My grandmother, nan, mum, and pop. I can understand seeing, but it's the other spirits that leaves me scratching my head. You see, I'm being haunted by the ghost of a little girl. She appears to be around the age of 8, with long braided brown hair and wearing a red and white dress that appears Victorian in design. She does not appear malicious, because I never feel any kind of fear or feel like she means me any harm. In fact, her presence feels joyful, filling whichever room I'm in with warmth and serenity when I see her. What sets the little girl apart from the spirits of my family members is that the little girl is more animated, dancing on the spot, twirling around as gracefully as a ballerina, and always smiling. Some nights when I lay in bed, I even feel 2 tiny arms wrapped round my waist, holding me until I drift off to sleep. Occasionally, but not often, I've heard her giggling, like she's in the middle of playing, and sometimes I hear her singing, but more often than not, I can't hear her, only see, like a program on the television after you've pressed the mute button. One of my friends who I've told about, Emily, has suggested that she could be the spirit of my daughter that I haven't had yet, or maybe the daughter of a past life, or even a little girl who's just looking for companionship in her afterlife, and saw something in me that she loved and connected to. Whatever the reason, and whoever she was or is, I love her, and I'm glad she's found a home with me. I have what I would call a guardian spirit. I've spoken to other people who've had experiences, and while they've had something similar, it's not been to the degree that I'm living with. When I was 14, I was experiencing a lot of depression and anxiety due to family issues and drama. I was emotionally unstable and isolating myself from everyone. During this time, I believed something malicious attached itself to me. I began hearing something scratching at night. I could feel it touch me at night and would see a bulky figure as well. During this time, another entity made itself known. It would whisper my name, comfort me, and awake me from nightmares. There was also one night I fell asleep crying and woke up in the middle of the night, holding my hands up in the air. I squeezed and felt substance, and when I looked to see who it was, it let go and my hand dropped. There was nothing. One night I felt it grab my shoulders and shake me awake. "Sissy, wake up." I woke up to the malicious spirit sitting on my chest smothering me. I had to physically push it off, and afterwards it stood at the foot of my bed watching me, and I felt the guardian sit down next to me on the bed as the aggressive one dissipated. Eventually the malicious spirit was gotten rid of, and the other one became very possessive over me. I haven't had many experiences with other spirits since I accepted its presence. I would often hear my name or Sissy when I was alone or upset. At the very least, it's good to know there's someone watching out for me. I live in North Carolina, in a once small county. I moved to the United States from Mexico in 2008 and moved into a really small cramped house that had 2 bedrooms and a bathroom, a kitchen and living room, where we pretty much started from zero, since we'd only just arrived to the US. It was me and my mum and dad and 5 other siblings, 3 brothers and 2 sisters. I was the youngest. We didn't have much. My 3 brothers and I shared a room while my parents and 2 sisters stayed in another room. One night I had to go to the toilet, so I got up and went to the bathroom. The bathroom was next to my parents' room. I heard something fall when I was in mid-piss. I thought nothing of it, since I had a lot of siblings and simply assumed it was one of them. After I was finished with my business, I washed my hands and decided to check who made that noise. As I walked into the room, I saw my sister was awake and looking in the corner of the wall like if someone was staring back at her. I thought it was so weird, so I asked what she was doing. She didn't answer me, and so I said, "Hey, I'm talking to you." Then she snapped out of her mind and looked at me with a really scared face. I was going to ask what happened, and then she started screaming for my mum. I got scared and jumped to my parents' bed. They woke up and asked what was going on. I said I didn't know. They told me to return to bed. After I left the room and stayed outside the door to listen to what they were talking about, I could hear my sister crying and telling my parents she saw a woman in a black dress. She said the woman was standing beside 2 children who looked to be burned. My parents told her it was just a dream and to go back to sleep. But she said that she wasn't sleeping when it happened. It was at that precise moment my parents looked at each other with fear painted on their faces. To try and appease her, they told my sister to lay down with them, so she did. I went to bed after, and a few days later my sister began screaming again. She woke up everyone in the house, claiming the lady was trying to grab her. All my siblings were confused. "What woman?" they asked. She said she saw the same woman from before, but this time she had tried to grab her. She said that she had woken up to use the bathroom when she saw the children on the opposite corner. Then the lady came from the hallway. She screamed as she approached her, but she wasn't walking, she was floating. As her hand was approaching my sister, all 3 of them suddenly vanished. My parents told her that she needed to stop making stuff up, but my sister insisted she was telling the truth. My mother at that point got very nervous and scared, because reading my sister's facial expressions, she could tell it wasn't a lie. She then told her to sleep with them, and the next day my mother called the local priest to bless the house. After that, the activity went down, and my sister didn't see the lady anymore. Well, one day, a pipe under the house broke, so my dad had to go into the crawl space to replace the pipe. He told all of my brothers to go down there with him to help, so we all followed. What we found still haunts me to this day. As soon as I stepped into the crawl space, I got a chill. I saw a lot of candles all over the place. They were red and they were black. I asked my dad why they were here. He replied saying they were probably just old candles that people didn't need. My brother called my dad and told him that he found a lot of books. My father said that that was nice, and to take him outside to see what kind of books they were. So my dad fixed up the pipe and left the crawl space. At that point, my brother comes up to him and asks him what are all the drawings on the book. He takes a look at the books and sees what can only be described as rituals. He then tells us to drop the books and go inside to get my mother. At that point, they talk about it, and I think they confirm that they were wicked, perhaps even demonic or witchcraft books. My mum then tells him to gather them up and set them on fire, which he does by pouring gasoline all over them. At that point, they start wondering if it's related perhaps in any way to what my sister had been seeing. We try to put it to the back of our minds though, go in and eat dinner, and then watch TV. But that same night, we hear my sister screaming. I hear my parents tell her what was going on, and she said the lady was really angry that they burnt her books. My sister and parents stayed up the rest of the night, and the next day they went to church to ask the priest what it could be. The priest said the house was cursed, and that we should move out. And my parents began looking right away for a new house to move into. Jose came back home. My sister told them that she was in the bathroom and she saw the lady appear out of thin air, and then apparently the lady asked for a favor. She said that the lady wanted my dad to open the chimney and clean it out. It was so late my parents called my uncle to tell him if he could come over the next day, to which he agreed. The next day when my uncle did come over, they proceeded to open the chimney up that was previously closed with bricks, and wasn't sure. As they opened the bottom, they found nothing. So they decided to open the top, where smoke comes out, and as soon as they did, the wind almost knocked my dad off the ladder. He thought it was strange but brushed it off, and when they finished, they found bones and ash. My dad got really scared at that point. He put the bricks back and went to the store and bought concrete and sealed the chimney off. My dad and uncle went inside and drank some beers, and my uncle offered my dad some space in his house while they found a house to move into. The next day, we packed up and left. Sometime after that, my dad got a house that we moved into, and everything went back to normal, and my sister, fortunately, stopped seeing the lady. This next event happened 2 or 3 years after we moved. My dad decided to move us to a bigger house, which seemed normal. On one night, my sister awoke and saw a black shadow on the side of her bed. She thought it was just her imagination, so she tried to fall back asleep. But the next day she told my parents, and they just assumed she was tired. A week after, my brother started seeing stuff too. He claimed he saw multiple shadows in his bedroom, and eventually my brother started ignoring the shadows. Then one night he woke up and saw a shadow right in front of him and another one by the door. The shadow then started whispering, but my brother couldn't make out any words. He then started praying, and the shadow vanished. When he went to my parents' room to tell them what happened, they told him he was tired and that it was all in his imagination. So my brother returned to his room to sleep, and never saw anything afterwards. A few years passed and my sisters moved out, and one day my sister came to visit and had to use the bathroom. So she went to my parents' room to use theirs since the others were occupied. She was doing her business when all of a sudden she got goosebumps, looked next to her and claimed she saw the Grim Reaper and started screaming, and my parents heard her screams. My parents ran to the bathroom and asked her what happened, and they found her on the floor crying. My sister said the Grim Reaper tried to take her. She then showed my parents her arm, and there were 3 scratch marks on it. She then left, and didn't return for a few more weeks for another visit. This final experience is my own. One summer day I was sleeping in my bed, and awoke as I had to use the bathroom. As I went to use it, I came back and felt a strange vibe in my room, so turned off the air conditioner and just stood in the doorway. Then the bed all of a sudden began shaking uncontrollably. I got scared and ran to my parents' room. My dad was on a business trip and wasn't in town, so I jumped on the bed and awoke my mum and told her what was going on. My mum told me to stop playing games and return to sleep. I told her that I wasn't playing a game and that we should go check on the bed. We both sat there quietly, listening, and she could hear my bed shaking. We started praying, and a few seconds later the bed stopped. I was so scared I asked my mum if I could sleep with her, and she agreed, and I fell asleep in her arms. The next day, my mum sprayed some holy water all over the room, and since then I've had no further experiences. October 31st, Halloween, Hallows Eve, or Samhain, as some of you may call it. I love reading or watching about the lore of this very unusual holiday. Throughout the years, I have grown to think of Halloween as more than just a holiday, but as a day for the gates of the spirit world and the human world to open up. It's been quite a while since my older foster sister has come to visit me, since we used to be really close. She was 10 years my senior, but she had alcohol fetal syndrome and was always mentally on my level. One day, a long time ago, when we shared the same bed, as my parents couldn't afford for all 5 children to have their own, so we shared a king size. We always used to have late night talks, and one night, when we were speaking, we spoke about what would happen if one of us were to pass. We promised each other that if this were to occur, we would let them know by opening and closing cabinet doors, dressers, or drawers. I no longer live with my parents, and she passed 6 years ago. Today my cat Bjorn was adamant about getting in the walk-in closet. I noticed the light was on, which the only person to have used it before me was my boyfriend, and he always makes a big fuss about turning it off. So I turned off the light and opened the door all the way to where it was almost touching the wall behind it. About an hour later, I rise to make myself some lunch and noticed the door was closed and that my cat was laying on the kitchen table. My fan was on, but it wasn't strong enough to cause a draft into that room. My cat didn't close it either. Could it be it was my sister dropping in on me today? This was late November of 2012, and I was doing an install in a winery in Northern California. It was a long day because we were working out of town, so we worked late to get it finished in one day. I started driving home around midnight and had about a 3-hour drive back home to Oakland. It's about 1:30 a.m. and I'm outside of Stockton, and I see this girl standing on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere. She's wearing a white dress that ends at about 3 inches above her knees, and she's barefoot, with long black hair flowing down her shoulders, and is standing statuesquely. I look at her as I drove by, but she didn't move, didn't acknowledge my loud truck as it passed or anything. I was pretty freaked out, because you always hear stories like this, and then she appears in your vehicle, but that wasn't the case. She just stood there in the night. The thing that was most weird to me was that it was a cold night, about low 40s, and was drizzling a bit, and she was wearing a short dress with no shoes standing on the asphalt. If this is just some girl who does this for fun to freak people out, I feel like she would have been extremely cold and shivering, but this girl didn't move. After I got home, I was still thinking about it and searched Ghost Girl outside of Stockton, CA, and found a bunch of articles and stories about the East 8 Mile Road Ghost Girl, and most of the descriptions fit what I saw to a T. I never went back to the area because I moved to another state shortly after, but I want to travel back there to see if I can find her again one day.